which will be accepted starting next year. And basically, the regulation has two measures. First, the exporters in any third countries, TC means third countries, the exporters in third countries must comply with their own national regulation on deforestation. So that's one. And the second, the requirement is that exporter must register their production site with their GPS coordinate. And that's the first step. And also they must issue a statement confirming that the production process for the said product did not involve deforestation. So this requirement is called a process of due diligence to verify that the product is not participating to deforestation when it comes to the EU. The due diligence document must be provided by the importers to the EU authorities before the product can cross the border of the EU. So we see that it's, at the moment, this regulation is not too much demanding, in the sense that there is no request for certification, there is no request for official certificates, but of course, the EU will make sure that the authorities or environmental protection or agriculture or whatever the competent authority for agriculture will enforce, or will at least make sure that this regulation, export regulation, is followed in the third countries. At the moment, it's very early. The regulation is not yet approved, but it's a matter of time, and it will be implemented progressively. So that's what I wanted to explain about this regulation. Yes, last week I was not very up to date, because this came up very lately. So now I give a small web link for those who want to have the detail of the regulation in English on the EU website. So now let's come back to the EU law. Perhaps you will remember from the last slides that the EU food law is organized in three main areas: authorities, business, and consumer. That's the ABC of the food law. Each of these groups are addressed in different ways. For example, also the law, the first aim, the first purpose of this law is to protect the health and interest of consumers. The law itself has no specific measure or specific, not much specific text on the right on consumer and how the consumer can find remediation if their interests are broken. So this is because the food law came after other laws that were protecting the consumer, and there is another law very important in the EU, which is called the Product Liability Law. So the legislators felt that this law was sufficient in addressing the rights and remedies of consumers, and specific to food safety, it was also felt that what is found unfit for consumption, the evidence is sufficient for the consumer to get redress and get compensation from the suppliers. That being said, the businesses are the primary targets of the law, because you will remember that business operators are responsible, the first and foremost responsible to ensure the safety of the product they place on the market or they handle. And the authorities have to ensure the compliance of food business operators to the law and the regulation. But this is a secondary responsibility in getting the food safety. So basically, this is a structure of the EU law. there is a large part explaining, providing the definitions and the general principles that have been taken into account and consideration. And the general principle also are reflected in all the other parts. The other parts are the interest of consumer, the power of authorities, and the business requirement. So now let me present the last two triangles, power of authorities and business requirements. The powers of authorities are again divided into executive tasks, enforcement systems, and incident management. Executive tasks describe with a great amount of detail how the scientific risk assessment should be organized in the EU. Then it covers what are implementing measures and how these are organized between the European Commission and the member states. After the law explain who is making decision and how the legislation are prepared and what are the respective roles of the Commission and the member states. And finally, the executive task cover the information and risk communication and provide details on what are the precedents and what are the relationship between the European Food Safety Agency, the European Commission, and the member states. Enforcement, of course, cover official controls in the member states and describe the nature of sanctions that can be applied when food which is not unfit for consumption is found on the market anywhere in the EU. The sanction may be administrative or may be criminal in certain cases. And also, of course, it describes in general terms what is the role of the EU as second line to monitor and verify that the member states are enforcing correctly the EU law. And then incident management is typically covers the communication between member states concerning food safety incidents or food safety events. That is, all this information is managed by an IT network called RASF, Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed. Incident management, the EU law also describe what minimum national measure should be in place, for example, recalls and communication. And it also states and demand that the European Commission and member states prepare and have a system for emergency measures. On the business side, and this is where the focus of this law is, because the primary responsibility for food safety is on business. The requirement cover the process, the products, and the presentation of product. By this, we call the information which is required when the food comes on the market. You may remember that the process requirements are grouped in what was called hygiene package, and it covers the nature and functionality of premises, the facilities, the production process. There is a large part of text describing hygiene, which is basically focused on HACCP adoption, and disposition related to trade with requirement on traceability and withdrawal of unfit food. Products, the law covers three main areas: product standards, approval requirements, and food safety limits. Product standards, I told the last week that there are very few product standards in the EU law and regulation, and we will understand why is it so in a few minutes in the later slides. But these product standards are mentioned in the EU law. And the second area is approval requirement. The law require for certain products like food supplement, additives, GMOs, and novel foods, the food has an arrangement that there must be an approval before these food products can be marketed, placed on the. And food safety limits, of course, we have this kind of standards, which are like a specification, or it's considered as a standard, describing what are the maximum limits in microbiological criteria and maximum residue limits for pesticides and veterinary drugs and contaminants like heavy metals or physical fields. And on the presentation of food, the law is very heavy on labeling. There are several articles in the law that prescribe in detail what are the labeling requirements. And publicity, the law also is it's quite detailed on what you can claim and what you cannot claim about food, and the extent of the claims and which kind of claims are allowed and not allowed. And finally, the law has arrangement on risk communication, explaining the role of risk communication and who should be in charge and how risk communication should be managed within the EC and in the member states as well. So let us go back to the making of this law, because it's very important and very useful to understand how the law has been prepared and why it is why it has this structure. It's very early in the beginning of the EU building that legislators were concerned about food safety and quality. The first period in 1977 to 1987, there have been many attempts to establish a common market for food products. And the approach was prescribing the composition of food. It was meant as vertical. Okay, we have, for example, cheese, or we have canned fish, or we have a given product. And the idea was that this product should be the same everywhere in any country of the EU. So, as you can imagine, it created lots of obstacles. First of all, the EU system was not adapted to this kind of approach. At that time, any legislation required unanimity for its adoption by the Council. And the member states had a right of veto. So it was very difficult to make all the 12 members to accept these vertical standards. And the second obstacle was the huge amount of work and the scale of the task that it represented. There were simply too many food products to do it. EU is very wide and very diverse in coverage, and as it's maybe the case in Indonesia also. So it's an amount of work for the legislator, and preparatory work was simply too big. As a result, there was very little progress over that period, and a few product standards have been developed, as I mentioned last week, and we'll see again this one. But at the same time, over this period, these are the product standards which have been successfully developed: sugar, honey, fruit juice, milk, spreadable fats, jams, jelly, marmalade, chestnut puree, coffee, chocolate, natural mineral waters, minced meat, eggs, and fish products. At the same time, the building of Europe was accelerating, and the second period from 87 to 97, there were many things that had happened. Because the food business were interested in placing more and more national products everywhere in the other member states. And this has created some conflicts and some court cases. And at one point, the Court of Justice has made a decision on a specific product that could be accepted everywhere in the EU. Also, the national legislation were different. And because the Treaty of the EU in 1977, the decision of the EU Court of Justice was mandatory, was taking precedence on the national courts. So this was the first time that the European Union allowed one product which had been accepted in one member state to be placed in the market in another country. And so it opens the way to harmonization, because that decision was a jurisprudence, and it opens the way for other products to be allowed. So the European Commission and the legislature try to harmonize standards based on common production practices, instead of trying to say, okay, we'll define what is cheese or what is spreadable fat as in the first period. They decide to work on a common process, or what is, for example, what is the way of making ham, or what is. But this also had mixed success, difficulties, and national specific situation were obstacles to this approach. And at this period, there has been a series of food crises in Europe: dioxin, bovine spongiform encephalopatitis. Sorry, I cannot remember that name. It's a viral disease in cattle. And this was very, very wide-ranging crisis, and very threatening. And there was a shift in consumer concerns. And by the end of the period, food safety really came at the forefront, and the pressure on legislators to adapt and to go ahead and produce a significant food law was sharply increased. So the third period was really a period of fast action. And there was, specifically after the BSE crisis, there was a report by a legislator, Mr. Medino. It's called the Medino report. Was very critical on how the Commission and how the EU had handled the BSE crisis. And it was an eye-opener for the EU authorities, and it urged the Commission to act and to build the food law. So the Commission prepared a green paper, which was meant only for discussion, which was giving the overall framework and the key issue to be considered. And that paper describes the key principle and explains the need for a food safety agency, and also stated that there would be a specific Directorate General, which was Health and Consumer, SANCO, to be solely responsible for food safety. What happened was that in the past, over the last two periods, there was no one single directorate of the Commission in charge. There was agriculture, there was consumers, there was health, and a few others. So, of course, these directorates, the Commission directorates, are very heavy, and it's difficult to coordinate. And so the process on food safety harmonization was very slow. So now, with this proposition, only one directorate was in charge of the food safety. Then, after the green paper, came a white paper, which was really a policy statement and a legal outline on how the food law would be prepared. And the white paper was a final draft for establishing the European Food Safety Authority, and a very detailed on how to produce this food law with some 84 specific legal steps that would have to be addressed timely. And you see that once this was done, 2 years later, the EU food law was passed because there had been lots of consultation and discussion in the previous years on the green and white paper. So what are the key principles of the law? It's a repetition a little bit, but I think that's more on the legal aspects. The primary and central principle is that the law serves to ensure the highest level of protection of the consumer's interest. There is a principle, a recognized principle is abuse principle, which states that businesses are responsible in the sense that the responsibility is understood. They are free to assess their product's conformity. They are free to self-assess that their food products are safe and wholesome. But if they abuse this freedom, then they are passible of, they can be sanctioned. So that's a little bit a change in the legislative principle, because in the past, in many European countries, it was the government or the authority which was responsible to make sure that the food was safe. With this principle, it's a bit of the contrary. It's a reversal. The business are responsible. They are free to use whatever system they see fit. They are responsible for the safety of their product. If they don't take the right approach or use the right tools, if they abuse this freedom, they will be sanctioned. Another principle is the Prohibition Principle. That's where for specific products which may have a negative impact on the health of consumer, there will be prohibition. Prohibition means either the product is not allowed or it has to be authorized. And authorization, this is what we have: positive list for additive, GMOs, novel food, etc. Another very important principle in the framework of the EU is a mutual recognition. What we mean is within the EU, this is also a very important aspect of the law. When there are no specific justification for trade restriction, products that have been lawfully produced and marketed in one member state may not be kept out of other member states' market on the grounds that they do not comply with national rules. So this is very important because it's and this principle is based on the first European Court of Justice decision on placing on the market products which have been declared compliant in one member state everywhere in the EU. So it's very important because in this law, it explains that the national decision may be overridden or they cannot oppose other national decision. So that's really very important for the functioning and the effectiveness of the EU law. Other principles, we have, of course, the integrated food chain approach. So there is no difference between primary agriculture, post-harvest, processing, handling, distribution, catering. No. This is only one continuum. As the food is food at every step of the chain, everybody is responsible to make sure that the food safety and the hygiene is guaranteed. Principle science-based approach, I had explained this, and Professor Dedi also had explained this in detail last week. assessment of risk must be based on sound documented scientific method and data. And so that's a legal requirement. Of course, you cannot just decide that something is unsafe if you cannot prove it. But there are cases where scientific knowledge is missing, or it's not sufficient to provide a firm conclusion. So in that case, the law states that there should be a principle of precaution. And if we don't know, or if we don't know enough, then the regulators should consider that, should be cautious and should consider that things are unsafe or may have a negative impact. So the highest risk scenario should be considered in case of doubt. So now I would like to remind you, because I am sure that many of the participants are familiar with this, the scientific principle of risk assessment. I think, yes. Risk assessment is based on 4 main areas or steps. First, hazard identification, which is based on toxicological studies. Hazard characterization, this means how the identified hazards has an impact on the human body and human health. So these are dose response assessment and risk estimates studies. The third area, the first step, is to assess the exposure of different group of the population, exposure assessment. And finally, risk characterization, because as we know that the level of risk is a function of the hazard and the probability of occurrence. So how this scientific principle have been developed gradually by the World Health Organization. And I will give an example in the next slides on contaminants, how the WHO methods and systems to ensure environmental health contaminants risk assessment. So this is, sorry, I have to take this out. Yeah. The objective of the program was to promote the harmonization of toxicological and epidemiological methods in order to have internationally comparable results. So you see, in 1973, so it was even at the very early time of the EU building, and the WHO was already developing these methods. And WHO has produced a series of monographs of methodological documents that were meant as recommendation for the assessment of risk, but that were not meant in any sense to be applied as recommendation for regulation or standard settings. So already at this time, WHO was aware that of separating the risk assessment and the risk management. And also at this time, the requirement and the focus on sound human data were available, which was preferred to animal studies. Animal and in vitro studies were meant to provide support and to be used mainly to supply evidence missing from human studies. There are several of these monographs, about maybe 50 or 70 texts, which go into the detail and of each steps of the risk assessment. This, for example, two of them are mentioned here: food safety, safety assessment of food additive and contaminants, and principle for the toxicological assessment of pesticide residue in foods. That was already 20 years later in 87 and 1990. That was also really the beginning of the raising of awareness in the EU consumers and worldwide on contamination and pesticides. Of course, risk assessment is based on scientific principles, and these principles are permanently reviewed by the WHO and FAO. We have seen last week that at the Codex Alimentarius Commission, they have a specific specific committees, and the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives is one, and there are 3 others. And this Joint Expert Committee ensure periodic review and evaluations when there are new manufacturing process, when there are new specifications for products, when new data becomes available on the biological properties of certain compounds or molecules, about the nature or biological properties of impurity come to light, when there are any advance in scientific knowledge relevant to the nature or mode of action of contaminants, when there are changes in consumption patterns, level of use or dietary exposure estimates, and when there are, of course, improved requirements for food safety, for safety evaluation. So this committee provide new guidance or state the need for new studies and revision of the conclusion of the previous risk assessment. So these are the main steps which I explained at the beginning on risk assessment. We have hazard identification. On the base on the outputs of hazard identification, the scientist or the person in charge of risk assessment has to organize a dose response assessment. What is dose response assessment? It means that we try to determine what dose has what is called a departure point. We use increasing dose of the contaminants, and we see which dose start having an impact. So the dose, this dose is the point of departure, and it corresponds below this dose. It's what's called no AEL, non-observable adverse effect level. So determining that non-observable adverse effect level is important because it's the lowest level at which the contaminant is not active. Based on this, there will be a risk characterization. And risk characterization is based on 2 things, the non-observable NOAL and the exposure assessment. Exposure assessment studies consist in estimating the daily intake, estimate daily intake. So that is an empirical work. It's scientific, but it's empirical, meaning that we consider a given population which is consuming the product, the contaminant, through food, and we'll try to determine, based on the population distribution, based on the cultural habits on consuming food, based on many other factors, what is the estimate daily intake of the contaminant. On the other end, we know that the food, this contaminant present is food, has a lowest level and non-observable adverse effect level. So based on that, there is a calculation of what is called the allowable daily intake. Allowable daily intake, it's a concept based on the the lowest active dose, which is derived and by considering uncertainty factors. So it's a calculation, it's based on the model of absorption and different factors, the nature of the contaminants. So we have two indicators to do the risk characterization: the allowable daily intake and the estimate daily intake. Allowable daily intake is a theoretical quantity that can be absorbed by the population without effect, cumulative effect. And the estimated daily intake is the reality. It's a measurement of what quantities people can absorb based on their food consumption habit. Characterization, the risk, is comparing this EDI with the allowable intake. Based on this comparison, we can say, yes, actually, the estimated daily intake is maybe higher or lower than the allowable daily intake. So given the situation, the real situation of consumption, and given the magnitude, the importance of the allowable daily intake, the risk assessment can say, yes, there is a risk, there is a significant risk that this contaminant may impact this population, and then this is the conclusion of the study. After that, other authorities can make decision or consider remediation or mitigation options to address the risk which has been characterized. So I will go a little faster in the next slides because, of course, people who have an interest in risk assessment will find this too short. But I just provide the main steps in each of the risk assessment function. And you will find more details on the WHO website on this and on a specific website on contaminants as well. Hazard identification start first, of course, the objective is to identify the hazard. If there is a new molecule which has been produced and which is claimed to be useful to process food, we have to make to identify if it's dangerous or if it's not. So this is the scope of toxicological studies, in vivo or in vitro. In vivo, this is humans, but predominantly rodents, rats and mice, and in vitro, cell culture and tissue preparation. There is, of course, a trend nowadays that animal experimentation is not very ethical, and as much as possible to reduce, refine, or replace animal testing by in vitro testing. But the in vitro testing is not yet capable of replacing animal testing for most endpoints of concern. So the principle of toxicological studies are to have a tier testing approach. This by a screening approach, start by broad and increase the accuracy of toxicological studies, or increase the focus. Of course, always requirement to use scientifically sound methods and approaches. And most importantly, have a robust study design. And also to be aware and to be well informed on the different mechanisms for absorption of the contaminant, distribution in the body, the metabolic pathways, and the excretion modalities, which will allow and refine the test and the species and doses to be used in the study. And of course, a study is as good as the quality of the statistical analysis, and it allows for critical data interpretation. So once you have the raw data, of course, scientists are used to take great care of cleaning the data, processing the data with statistical software, and trying to understand what are the genuine variation and what are outliers and data which are a little bit aberrant. So these are a few examples of studies which are toxicological studies which can be conducted. I will not read all these details. I just put this in the slide for further reference for the participants. There are many different type of toxicity testing: general systemic toxicity, short-term, acute or subchronic, genotoxicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive developmental toxicity, how a contaminant can affect the growth of infants and young children, prenatal, postnatal, etc., etc. Several different studies depending on the population and depending on the perspective of the effect of the contaminant. So again, the WHO methodological guidelines call for highlight the fact that the most important steps in risk assessment is the critical evaluation of study designs before the study is done and interpretation of the results. So the key considerations are human relevance, study designs, statistical analysis, interpretation of findings, and assessment of direct and indirect effects, and weight of evidence approach. Now, the second steps will be hazard characterization. So it includes dose response assessment and the determination of point of departures, and then extrapolation of this point of departure, low observed adverse effect level and no observed adverse effect level, to extrapolation to the human population, which is of concern. And then, as the last step, is defining results from this, the ADI and EDI. Dose response assessment, the first point, yes, it's based on modeling. Modeling is how determining how the contaminants will find its way in human body and what will be the impact. And the study, this is toxicology study, is providing the contaminant under an adequate way for food or drink or by injection, and observing, analyzing the impact on the subject health and body and behavior. So by using increasing or decreasing dose, the scientists can determine the relevant endpoint and which species and which class of animal are affected by the contaminants. Determination of the point of departure, which is the lowest level at which the contaminant will have an effect or no effect observed. Extrapolation. Extrapolation is determining the allowable daily intake or allowed daily intake based on the point of departure levels. The scientists consider uncertainty factor and chemical specific adjustment factors. So these are kind of calculation to decrease again the allowable level, starting from the non-observed adverse effect level. These factors divide this dose, divide this concentration by a certain parameter. Maybe 10, it may be 10. It depends on the toxicokinetics and toxicodynamics, the way the contaminants go into the body. It depends on the difference between the rodent model and humans and many other factors. But that is the principle. Once we have the lowest level of action of the contaminant, we still apply security factors or uncertainty factor, but based on the principle of precaution, we divide the lowest available, we reduce it by a magnitude of 10 or 100, depending on the severity of the contaminants. And then this allows to give an acceptable daily intake without appreciable health risk. And there are, of course, consideration in regard with the margin of exposure calculation and possible carcinogenicity or increased incidence of carcinogenicity, even at this lowest level, and other consideration. So on the other hand, exposure assessment, the one that we have seen is the determination of point of departure, determination of the lowest level of toxicity of a contaminant. Now, in this exposure assessment, it's an empirical, it's studying the real way humans are consuming a certain food which is concerned by this contaminant. So there will be a first estimate. We have several different methods like regional maximum level in standards and different ways, different tools to assess the exposure of a population to this contaminant. So at the first, the scientists use screening methods, which are not very accurate, but allow to give to give the broad lines of the consumption patterns and the possible intake of the contaminants. These are the study of regional diets and the maximum level of contaminants which are allowed in current standards. So these methods give a broad first estimate, and of course they are not very much time consuming, and they require few data, and they are not very costly. But when you want to have a more accurate estimate, you have to consider specific reports on the use level of a given food category for a given population, or you have to organize, go to specific data for this contaminant or that food, which is called monitored levels, or even total diet studies, or studies of the use of the contaminant as consumed levels. So these are studies of a specific group of food susceptible to contain the contaminants. And then all these are calculations based on the quantity of food consumed, the average concentration of the possible contaminant in this food. And of course, these kind of studies are more, these are kind of real life studies by making surveys by certain groups of consumers. So of course, it requires more time and cost. And this is the way the estimated daily intake is measured or calculated by different studies of the ways a given population group is consuming a specific food which contains the contaminant of interest. So there are a few considerations on what the exposure assessment should consider. I will not go into the detail because all these factors are for the scientists or the professional which are involved in exposure assessment. I just mentioned this for our auditors today because they may be associated at some point in the future, or maybe they have been associated in a risk assessment exercise. either as observers or as experts, or in their professional life, they may be exposed to risk assessment reports. So it's important to be knowledgeable on all these factors and how the different tools which are used in exposure assessment. So if we compare, for example, as you will remember, the non-observed adverse effect level, NOAL, let us say we have an NOAL level of 500. When we use the uncertainty factor and the chemical specificity adaptation factors, when we derive the acceptable daily intake, you see that there is a reduction of 100 times from 500 of the lowest active dose level. The scientists will consider usually 100 time reduction to calculate the acceptable daily intake. On the EDI, it's basically it's daily food consumption pattern, multiply the quantity of food which is eaten, multiply by the concentration of the contaminant or the additive in the food. And then the risk assessment, the last step is to compare the estimated daily intake with the acceptable daily intake. If the estimated daily intake, which is the quantity of people may consume for this contaminant, if it's lower than the accepted daily intake, there is no need to continue the study, and there is no need to refine the data. It means that with this consumption pattern and this group of people, their consumption is not above what is acceptable. But if with the estimated daily intake is found to be superior, to be greater than the acceptable level, then the risk assessment must continue. We have seen that the estimated daily intake is based on consumption studies. So maybe the risk assessment will consider additional studies for a specific subpopulation. For example, children, or infants, or the elderly, or people in the mountains, because they are eating less fish or more or whatever. So the refinement of the study need to seek more, maybe more realistic scenario. We have also to verify the exceedance. The comparison has to be done across all the life stage at different time of the life of the consumer. So there are different ways of refining the risk characterization until we have a sufficient accuracy given to a specific population or part of the population, and we can conclude that there is no risk or there is a risk for specific persons. And then based on these findings and based on this assessment description of the hazard and the risk characterization, regulators or competent authorities can consider regulatory actions. So thank you very much. This is at the moment the first part of my presentation, and I see that we have maybe a few questions. We will take the question at the end of the session. And for now, I am handing back to the host for the following item of the agenda. Thank you very much.
Baik, ini untuk kalian berarti sudah paparan ya, dilanjutkan dengan paparan Prof. Dedi.
Baik, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Baik, saya teruskan. Saya diminta untuk menyampaikan temuan-temuan drafts sebetulnya. Ya. Saya share screen aja. Kelihatan?
Ya, Pak.
I think I was requested to present the data on the rejection of Indonesian food products in the EU market based on the EU RAFs notification. So it will be brief. So I would like just to inform you that saya mengambil data dari RAFs tahun 2020 ya. Sebetulnya data ini banyak sebelumnya, tapi saya coba mengambil data dari sini dan kemudian juga mengambil data dari beberapa laporan yang sudah disampaikan, baik dari jurnal, scientific jurnal maupun dari tempat lain. Nah, ini mungkin dulu saya sampaikan bahwa di RAFs itu tahun 2019 itu banyak notifikasi yang dikeluarkan yaitu berdasarkan kategori-kategori bahaya dan kemudian risikonya. Nah, kalau kita lihat di sini, ini yang merah ini bermacam-macam nih hazard di sini kategorinya. Ya, ada kaitannya dengan fraud, adulteration, kemudian kaitannya dengan kontaminan. Tadi kita mendengarkan kaitannya dengan kontaminan, ya, komposisi, aditif, ya, ada kontaminan biologik, kemudian kontaminan kimiawi, chemical contaminants, kemudian lingkungan juga. Ini adalah poin-poin yang memang dimonitor oleh EU RAFs ini. Kemudian pelabelan juga dimonitor, terutama jika ada pelabelan yang salah, mungkin kaitannya dengan fraud ya, pelabelan ini. Kemudian logam juga. Nah, ini yang banyak juga dilakukan adalah food contact materials, itu dimonitor bagaimana apa ada migration dari kemasan ke dalam pangan. Itu mereka aktif sekali di sini untuk monitor. Kemudian mycotoxin juga, nanti kita akan lihat di sebelah kanan ini yang data mana-mana yang sering mereka temukan di dalam monitoring dari produk-produk impor. Patogen sudah tentu, ya. Residu pestisida tadi sampaikan juga, itu yang dimonitor. Residu obat hewan sudah tentu. Nah, saya ingin memperlihatkan juga di sebelah kanan ini data ya. Ada yang undecided, itu berarti masih belum ada keputusan, tapi yang perlu kita monitor adalah mungkin yang serius ini. Yang serius ini kalau kita lihat alergen ternyata ini banyak sekali di notifikasi. Jadi mereka concern sekali terhadap adanya alergen di dalam pangan. Terutama alergen biasanya dikaitkan dengan label. Jadi mungkin ada label yang tidak mencantumkan warning kemungkinan adanya alergen dalam produknya. Ya. Kita lihat di sini ada 235 kali notifikasi di sini, ya, alergen. Kalau kita turun di sini, kemudian composition. Saya kira komposisi adalah juga kaitannya dengan data dasar daripada produk yang bersangkutan. Kita lihat lagi ke bawah, ada bahan asing, kemudian ke bawah lagi yang banyak nih saya perlihatkan adalah logam, ya, logam, kontaminan logam. Nah, mycotoxin ini ternyata banyak ditemukan. Nanti kan kita lihat bahwa Indonesia termasuk salah satu yang termonitor juga terkait dengan aflatoksin dalam nutmeg, sebenarnya dalam biji pala, ya, di sini. Ke bawahnya lagi ada natural toxin, saya kira tidak terlalu banyak. Tapi patogenik mikroba ini yang sampai 794 temuan, notifikasi. Jadi memang produk-produk yang, terutama yang kalau patogenik, biasanya produk-produk fresh pangan-pangan segar biasanya di situ, ya. Jadi lebih banyak pada hygienic practice nanti yang dimonitor di situ, residu pestisida juga. Nah, ini hanya untuk memperlihatkan bahwa itulah data yang mereka monitor. Dengan demikian maka kita sebagai negara pengekspor ke Eropa juga harus concern gitu ya, harus memperhatikan ini di mana-mana faktor-faktor risiko yang mungkin ada di dalam pangan kita, dalam supply chain pangan kita dari hulu sampai ke hilir. Tadi disampaikan oleh Mr. Alain bahwa kalau kita bicara from farm to table itulah continuum. Kita tidak membeda-bedakan antara satu rantai dengan rantai lainnya. Pokoknya pangan itu harus memang diperhatikan secara continuum dari hulu sampai hilir agar supaya tidak ada risiko yang bisa terjadi di situ karena adanya bahaya. Nah, dengan demikian bisa katakan bahwa kita harus memang mengkaji mengapa produk-produk kita yang ditolak itu seperti apa. Nah, saya akan sampaikan data berikutnya. Nah, ini kebetulan data ini di dalam paper, ini pada SEP ini dari Badan POM, waktu belajar doktor di Wageningen University di sana, pada SEP mempelajari tentang market access, saya kira bagus sekali, dan kemudian melihat level food safety, kemudian bagaimana cara memperbaiki kondisi-kondisi tersebut. Kebetulan saya waktu itu ikut menguji doktornya di Wageningen, saya ke sana untuk menguji beliau. Ini contoh mungkin yang ditemukan. Ini temuan dari RAPS juga sebetulnya. Kalau kita lihat dari tahun 2001 itu sudah mulai ada sebetulnya notifikasi tersebut. Nah, ini kaitannya memang dengan udang yang pada saat itu banyak dimonitor terkait dengan antibiotik. Ada kandungan chloramphenicol dalam udang ditemukan, dan memang kalau kita lihat tahun-tahun 2002 ini gencar-gencarnya waktu itu monitoring dari EURAPS terkait dengan antibiotik dalam udang. Nah, kalau kita lihat selanjutnya memang dia turun ya. Alertnya memang ada nih beberapa kali alert ya. Kemudian informasinya lebih banyak. Jadi ini karena ada komunikasi yang bagus Eropa dengan kita, kemudian memberikan juga capacity building, maka alhamdulillah memang notifikasi menjadi turun terkait dengan chloramphenicol ini ya. Nah, kemudian yang juga disoroti dalam paper tersebut adalah aflatoksin. Memang aflatoksin sampai yang sekarang masih ada masalah, tapi saya kira sudah dibicarakan itu sekarang. Sudah ada solusinya ya. Kemudian nah, paling tinggi tahun 2016 itu. Jadi ini terkait dengan aflatoksin dalam biji pala atau nutmeg di sini. Dan itu memang ada dispute nih, di mana sebetulnya terjadi peningkatan aflatoksinnya, apakah di hulu, apakah di tengah-tengah jalan, apa di hilir gitu ya. Nah, itu kemudian menjadi dispute untuk diteliti. Ya. Di mana kemungkinan terjadinya? Apakah karena storage dari pala tersebut sudah kering atau sebelumnya? Tapi itu informasi yang kemudian diperoleh dan kita lihat ini cukup tinggi di sini ya. Tahun 2016 memuncak di situ. Nah, kemudian yang lainnya ini juga data terkait dengan kalau mereka nyebutnya adalah data herbs and spices from Indonesia. Ini saya kira ini kaitannya juga dengan nutmeg, dengan pala tadi. Tapi kalau kita lihat memang di tempat-tempat lain juga banyak, ya. Artinya notifikasi di ASEAN ini juga cukup berlangsung terus gitu ya. Di sini kebetulan Indonesia aja karena kaitannya dengan nutmeg ini, maka tahun 2016 adalah puncaknya di situ. Ya. Kemudian turun sudahnya. Ya. Tapi kita ingat bahwa kasus-kasus antibiotik, saya kira tadi saya katakan sudah kayaknya sudah berakhir, sudah lama gitu ya. Sekarang ada kasus-kasus baru, aflatoksin masih ada. Nah, ini kaitannya dengan notifikasi tahun 2000 sampai 2010, ini ringkasan sebetulnya. 2011 sampai 2020. Ya. Ini dibandingkan di antara negara-negara ASEAN, ya. Indonesia yang biru ini itu terkait dengan tadi ya aflatoksin juga. Nah, inilah kemudian temuannya, cephalopod, saya kira bangsa octopus, gurita dan sebagainya, itu menjadi sorotan juga. Kebetulan kami melakukan penelitian prioritasi terkait dengan cephalopods dan tuna, kemudian salmonella, kemudian dalam udang dan sebagainya. Itu nanti saya akan sampaikan pada sesi terakhir barangkali setelah kita diskusi ini. Itu betul-betul itu case study terkait dengan ekspor refusal dari Indonesia ke EU. Kita membahas dari segi economic risk, kemudian dari segi health risk-nya, kemudian kita akan sampai kepada kesimpulan komoditi apa yang kemudian menjadi beban kita dilihat dari economic risk. Tapi itu nanti belakangan setelah saya menyampaikan draft ini. Nah, jadi disebutkan bahwa memang dikatakan itu kaitannya dengan fraud adulteration, ya. Itu antara 2007 sampai 2020 di sini. Kita di sini ada yang biru ya, di sini tahun 2011. Jadi ini mungkin kaitannya dengan 2016 tadi, ya, terkait dengan nutmeg tadi. Nah ini sangat spesifik juga di sini bahwa kaitannya kenapa disebut fraud adulteration itu sepertinya kaitannya dengan improper health certificate, gitu ya. Kemudian ada report-report yang kemudian tidak lengkap, gitu ya. Jadi, mungkin nanti kita akan diskusikan. Nanti kita akan tanyakan ke Mr. Alain apa yang dimaksud dengan improper health certificate, gitu ya. Kalau tadi jelas, kalau kaitannya dengan penolakan karena aflatoksin nutmeg jelas. Gitu. Tapi kalau kaitannya dengan improper health certificate, nah itu mungkin perlu kita bahas dengan Mr. Alain. Jadi sebetulnya kaitannya dengan nutmeg juga di sini. Nah ini kemudian cephalopods ya, jadi kelompok-kelompok tadi gurita dan octopus di sini. Nah ini sangat spesifik juga karena ternyata ini ada illegal importation of octopus from Indonesia, tetapi dikirim dari Thailand tahun 2007. Nah ini juga kita perlu penjelasan seperti apa. Mungkin rekan-rekan dari BKIPM mungkin barangkali sudah mengetahui tentang ini. Ya. Saya hanya menyarikan saja dari sini. Ya, saya belum bisa menelusuri apa sebabnya. Ya. Kemudian ada lagi improper health certificate, masih dikaitkan dengan kata-kata itu. Ya. Dan adanya sodium erythrorbate, itu semacam pengawet sebetulnya. Ada dalam boil cut octopus. Ya. Kembali ya, lack of proper health certificate for crab meat directly exported from Indonesia tahun 2019. Nah, kayak gini sebetulnya kita harus diskusikan, ditanyakan mengapa terjadi seperti ini. Ya mungkin nanti kaitannya juga barangkali terkait dengan conformity assessment dan sebagainya. Mungkin nanti pada bagian berikutnya itu akan dibahas. Ini juga summary saja, saya kira apa yang dinotifikasi oleh IURAP. Saya akan tidak hanya memperlihatkan saja. Kembali ini kalau kita lihat herb and spices, ini juga paling tinggi di notifikasi di sini. Terkaitnya sama saja tadi dengan aflatoksin. Ya. Nah ini data seperti apa sih penolakannya? Itu sudah dibagi-bagi. Ada yang disebut alert, ya. Memang ada border rejection, ditolak di border. Nah ini kalau kita lihat border rejection, ya, produk-produk kita ditolak memang di border di sini. Ya. 18 kali notifikasi di sini ya. Thailand hanya banyak juga tuh, ada border rejection sampai 23 kali di sini Thailand. Kemudian hanya sekedar informasi saja. Ya. Tapi ini data ini menunjukkan bahwa memang kalau sudah border rejection berarti itu sudah ditolak. Mungkin harus direekspor dan sebagainya. Nah itulah yang kami hitung pada bagian terakhir nanti dari presentasi kami, itu menghitung seperti apa sih kehilangan kehilangan pasar karena kejadian ini, kami menghitung juga dampak dari kesehatannya, jadi dampak misalkan kematian atau hospital, kemudian potensi dari loss, economic loss dari penolakan ini, itu akan saya sampaikan case study-nya nanti pada bagian terakhir setelah Pak Alen menjelaskan tentang Conformity Assessment. Oke, saya kira itu contoh daripada temuan-temuan di RAPS. Nah, ini juga terlihat di sini. Nah, ini tadi saya mengatakan bahwa ada improper health certificate, seperti itu. Nah, ini juga kalau kita di warna yang ini nih, merah tua, merah bata, ini 18 kali. Ini sama tadi lah, border rejection itu kan sebetulnya. 18 kali, kemudian masalahnya seperti sebelah kiri ini, kalau kita lihat yang banyak itu illegal importation, mungkin maksudnya juga illegal importation termasuk juga bahaya-bahaya yang ditemukan dalam produknya. Tapi yang menarik adalah health certificate tadi, analytical report yang dipermasalahkan di sini, mungkin tidak sesuai dengan kenyataan. Dan disebutnya itu memang fraud adulteration kategori gitu ya. Tapi bagaimanapun juga ini adalah data, dan nanti kita harus mengantisipasi bagaimana kita menekan ekspor ini, terutama kita harus mengetahui apa penyebabnya, dan kita harus melihat faktor-faktor risiko yang menyebabkan kejadian itu, dan itu mungkin yang harus kita evaluasi. Kembali, saya nanti akan sampaikan contoh dari case study, bagaimana kita melakukan kajian prioritasi, risk ranking, prioritasi, kemudian kita mencari faktor risiko untuk bisa menghitung namanya food safety objective, ya, adalah muatan daripada bahaya pada produk akhir pada saat kita konsumsi, pada saat kita makan. Tapi nanti saya akan jelaskan pada bagian terakhir. Nah, itu saja mungkin sekedar informasi bagaimana IURAS memonitor pergerakan importnya, pergerakan ekspor dari negara-negara ke Eropa, dan kemudian apa-apa saja yang mereka monitor, dan itu saya kira jelas, dan kita juga kena. Kebetulan di sini kaitannya tadi terkait dengan nutmeg di sini. Tadi disampaikan oleh Adasep, nutmeg. Kemudian yang lainnya adalah karena health certificate, improper health certificate. Itu saja mungkin Pak Widi sebagai tambahan untuk menyampaikan informasi bagaimana produk kita yang ditolak di Eropa. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih Prof. Dedi. Ini tadi di chat juga ada pertanyaan ya, sudah sambil dijawab.
Excuse me?
Ya, halo.
Excuse me? Perhaps I can have a comment to Professor Dedi's presentation of notifications in the EU. It's only half a year ago or so we carried out 2 webinars or workshops about the main problems for Indonesian food products exported to Europe. And these the 2 areas which came out, because there are more, but it's also minor ones. But the 2 major areas which came out, it was nutmeg, where we have problems with aflatoxins, and it was fish products where there are problems with histamine. With regard to the nutmeg, because now we have talked a lot about spices and so on, it's not necessary, and I don't like this word fraud because it sounds like it's criminals who are exporting to Europe. It's of course, if some documentation is incomplete, you can say it's perhaps lack of knowledge or other things, which actually is the reason why it's incomplete. But with regard to documentation which looks right, the sampling has been done in Indonesia, and it has been brought by a boat or whatever to Europe. And then suddenly when it is in Europe, it fails, the aflatoxin is there. And what is the reason for that? Quite often, there are two reasons quite often, and it is firstly the sampling for nutmeg. It is a bit complicated. It can easily be done wrong, and then you don't get the results you should have. They are kind of incorrect. The second chance or risk is that during the transportation, these nutmegs are in a more humid environment than they should be, and then they develop aflatoxins. So therefore, it is more about ensuring that the sampling is correct, ensuring that the transportation conditions are perfect for nutmegs. Then you can avoid these notifications in Europe. The funny thing is, when you look in Europe, now I just looked at how the notifications come in or pop up in ASEAN countries. It's mostly border control. In Europe, it's also the companies themselves which find out when they check the product before they put it into their own products. When they check them, then they find out that something is wrong here, and then they inform the authorities. So it's also the control system at the plants, at the food manufacturing companies, which find a lot of these products which cannot be used in food in Europe. So it was just a little comment to this, that it sounds so bad with this fraud, but it's not necessarily fraud as we usually use this word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carsten. I think it's very important you mentioned about that, because that's what the fact, right? But particularly what the problem is, actually we have to go to the assessing the risk factor. Actually, we mentioned about the sampling, right, from the farm to up to the maybe to the boarding in EU. One of the problems is really transportation. That's why when we have the problem, we have to start to determine what is the risk factor there. Okay. Apparently, you mentioned that the sampling means actually apparently that there is a contamination, right, of aflatoxin in the product actually, right? Or maybe sampling mistaken, or maybe there is a reality that aflatoxin is there. That's, you mentioned about sampling.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's true. It's not only for nutmeg. Also, when we talked about histamine, the problem was a bit the same. It develops in fish products when they are not cooled down sufficient during the transportation, for example. Yeah. And if there is something missing, or there can also be fraud in the transportation system, that they have written that everything cooled down to -25 or how much it is, but it has actually not been it all the way. Then histamine is developing, and then no matter how good the sampling is, you will not find it before you actually check it before use. But it's also there are things which there are other things you should look at in this value chain than just only on the certificate and the product you sit with when you have in hand when you test. It's quite often you should go upstream and check if everything is done correctly there, and also sometimes downstream from the test.
Okay, thanks. Later on, I will explain to you about the problem of histamine. Right? We have a case study. How it's a problem, in shrimp and tuna. Why it happens. So we go to the risk factor again. But later on, after conformity assessment presentation, I will continue with this. Okay. Thank you very much.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Dedi. Ini tadi kita di chatroom ada beberapa pertanyaan untuk lain. Ini tadi pertama dari Ibu Ratih Dewi. Ini tadi sudah dijawab oleh Alain. Ada Ibu Ratih.
Iya, Bu.
Ya, itu tadi sudah pertanyaan Ibu tadi dijawab di chatroom. Apakah ada komentar untuk jawaban dari Mr. Allen?
For the answer
Oh.
from Mr. Alain, everything is clear. Thank you, Mr. Alain.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Oke, baik Ibu Rati, terima kasih. Selanjutnya pertanyaan dari Pak Arief dari KKP. Ada Pak Arief?
Iya Bu, siang.
Ya, apakah jawaban dari Mr. Allen sudah jelas atau ada hal lain terkait ini yang mau ditanyakan?
Mungkin tambahan saja Bu.
Ya, silakan Pak.
Jika kami sudah menetapkan batas melalui peraturan nasional, apakah perlu ditetapkan lagi RPA sesuai ketentuan Uni Eropa, begitu Bu? RPA yang saya tanyakan di situ.
No, of course, I don't know which product and contaminant product is seafood, but contaminant, I don't know exactly which contaminant you are mentioning. But if Indonesia competent authority has decided on MRL based on their own risk assessment, then there is no need to have a specific reference point for action, because this reference point, these are equivalent to, similar to MRL when the risk assessment is not yet done. So for a given contaminant, as soon as the country regulation have an MRL, the reference point for action are not necessary. But of course, you have to be sure that the request from the FAA or the request from the EC, which contaminant do they consider, and make sure that the exact same contaminant is covered by the decision, the regulatory decision.
Ya, terima kasih Mr. Alain. Sepertinya cukup dulu.
Baik,
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Alain dan Pak Arief. Untuk selanjutnya mungkin dilanjutkan paparan lagi, Pak Dedi.
Alain.
Ya, untuk selanjutnya Alain akan memaparkan mengenai akses ya. Silakan Alain.
Yes, I have in my slides. I have a. Yeah, we can go to conformity assessment. That's
Yeah,
fine.
Conformity Assessment Schemes for Food Products.
Okay, wait. My slides are. I have to jump several slides. Give me a few seconds, please. Okay. Yes, now it's okay. So we will have an oversight on how conformity assessment tools and functions are used in EU food regulation. So first, we should consider what are the main functions of conformity assessment in reference to the ISO Conformity Assessment Committee. The definition of a CIA conformity assessment scheme is a documented system describing how different conformity assessment techniques are interrelated and used for a stated purpose. So conformity assessment techniques include audit, evaluation, testing, and releases. Audit is a systematic, as per the definition of ISO, we have to follow the international definitions, systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So this is a very generic definition, and it's on purpose because with this definition, you can address audit requirement in any sector and any activity. Evaluation is slightly different. It's the process of gathering evidence about whether an object of conformity, that can be a product, a process, or a service, meets specified requirement. It's much limited in scope. We compare an object of conformity, an object of investigation. We compare it to specified requirement. Does this object meet this specification? ISO and this Committee on Conformity Assessment have a specific way of defining the conformity assessment function. And this is called the functional approach. So they start by requirement. We have specific requirement. And the first thing is to select the object of conformity assessment. What is the object which is submit to conformity assessment? Once this is done, the process step is to get information on the selected item. And then it's what they call determination. Determination is a comparison between the compliance level, conformity level, between the specification or the criteria and the object. Once this determination is done, information is derived on fulfillment of the specified requirement. This is reviewed separately, and a decision is made on whether the object fulfills the specified requirement sufficiently or not. If not, there is an attestation, and if yes, this is the end of the process. So we have audit, we have inspection, we have evaluation, and we have inspection. Inspection, in the meaning of ISO CASCO, is the examination of an object, which can be a product, a process, or a system, by an operator, and I highlight here by the human sense of an operator. Inspection is basically carried out on the base of human sense, with or without small handheld tools or small tools, but basically the human sense are the primary tool. To determine its conformity with specific requirement, or inspection is also determine the conformity on the basis of professional judgment. Conformity with general requirement on the basis of professional judgment. So we see that for inspection, the determination of conformity is made on the basis of knowledge, experience, interpretation skills, and professional judgment of the inspection body's personnel. The inspection can include visual examination, measurement or testing of physical items, examination of specification documents, such as design drawings, comparison of the findings with the requirements of specification documents, or with generally accepted good practice in the field, and drawing up a report on the result of the inspection. Testing, it's a part of conformity assessment, which allows the determination of one or more Testing is a determination of one or more characteristics of an object of conformity assessment according to a procedure. It applies to material, products, or processes. Yes, we can test processes. And this is particularly relevant in food safety, but also in other fields like IT or robotics. So allow me to make a separate mention of what is required for good testing. Good testing is based on competent people. It's based also on validated test methods, which are repeatable and reproducible. Good testing relies heavily on properly maintained and calibrated equipment. Good testing results also demand to have the knowledge of uncertainty value and their impact on regulatory determination, in particular when the testing results are used for verifying conformity to regulation. It requires measurements which are traceable to the SI standard units of measurements. Good testing also requires correct and adequate sampling and handling of test items and correct reporting and interpretation of results. So these are the key points on testing as a conformity assessment method. So now validation and verification. This is also, this can be a confirmation of the reliability of information declared in claims. And there is a difference between validation and verification. Validation is something which is applied in the case of an intended future use or projected outcome. It's before the product is processed on a routine or daily basis. Verification is applied to claims regarding events that have already occurred or results that have already been obtained. Conformity assessment has also an important step, which is the attestation of conformity. Attestation of conformity is based on the outcomes of one or more conformity assessment techniques: audit, evaluation, testing, inspection. And it allows to create evidence of the fulfillment of requirement. Very often, attestation of conformity takes the form of issuing a statement of conformity, which is a written document. Attestation of conformity can be made in three ways under the ISO-CLASCO approach. It can be done by a first party, meaning a manufacturer or supplier, which is the owner of the object of conformity. That's also called self-declaration. Attestation of conformity can be made by a second party. What that relates to a trade relationship. Between trade relationship, basically there are two parties, the supplier and the buyer. So in that case, the purchaser or the buyer or the user of the object of conformity will do the investigation, do the conformity assessment technique, and attest the conformity for the supplier. And the last way, it's a third party, which is not related to the manufacturer, supplier, or the customer, or their customer. So that is a third-party testing laboratory, a third-party inspection body, or certification body. So now we will see a little bit in detail what does all this mean in the context of food safety regulation. For inspection, inspection by competent authority is meant as a set of physical and or documentary checks carried out by persons designated by a competent authority in order to verify the compliance of a food business and or compliance of their product with the requirement of applicable regulations. So in this definition, we see that the checks are carried out by persons designated by a competent authority. And this is because this might be competent authority staff. Of course, they have the primary mandate, but in some cases, we'll see this later, in some cases, competent authority may designate other persons outside of their organization to carry out the inspection. When it comes to audit, audit means a systematic and independent examination to determine whether activities and their related conform with plan arrangements. Examination to determine whether these arrangements are implemented effectively, and examination to determine whether the arrangements are suitable to achieve the stated objective of the organization. And the audit outcomes can be used for certification. Of course, we have seen that attestation of conformity is based on any of the conformity assessment technique, but audit is one of the main conformity assessment technique used to certify products and systems. So what is important is this definition and the application to food safety management system is audit is carried out by a systematic and independent examination. Systematic and independent. Systematic relates to the audit process and procedure, and there is a whole standard on how to audit. And I think, if I am not mistaken, it's the ISO 1710, or I don't know. There is an ISO standard describing how audit should be performed. And now, what about independent? When you have a food business, you have some process and you have to keep internal audits. And that's also true for system for primary production, good agricultural practices, or whatever. Independent means that the person who implements the process, the person who realizes certain tasks, cannot audit themselves. You cannot audit your own work. So even if it's within a company, you have to find a way to have a different person to come and examine the 3 points of the audit. Are the activity in place? Are they in place and are they conform with the planned arrangement in the company, in the food business? Are the activity implemented effectively? And are they suitable, fit for purpose? Do they match the policy objective or the requirement of my business? The person who carry out this audit cannot be the same person who implement or who carry out the task which is audited. Validation. In the context of food safety, this is a conformity assessment technique which is used before starting to operate any risk management system. Validation of GAP or GMP, validation of operational prerequisite, validation of parts of the HACCP plan. Validation is also required in a food safety management system after any modification or improvement of the management system. So the questions that we ask ourselves when we organize a validation are, for example, do the selected provisions enable to reach the targeted security level? Is this combination of provision efficient, or combination of controls efficient to ensure the control of the food safety risks that have been identified? There are several means to validate a task or a procedure or a process. We can compare the nature of the procedure or process to some approved guidelines. So we refer to the Codex guidelines, or in some countries there are industry guidelines. And if we follow the guidelines point by point, we can be satisfied that the process or the PRP, for example, or the GMP are validated. For some cases, particularly for a specific process like sterilization or HACCP plan or others, we need to have experimental tests or mathematical stimulation models and demonstrate by calculation that our model or our process has a sufficient capability to address the food safety risk. And also we can do assessment of our system and our process on the basis of available data on foodborne risk. We compare the performance of our process by doing tests on the resulting contamination or hygiene level after the process. And we compare this data to accepted data from the industry or from the competent authority or from any available data. Once we have done this comparison, we can keep the record, we can keep the data, and so we can demonstrate to anybody, it can be our customers or it can be auditors, we can demonstrate that our process or our procedure has a similar effect or has a similar efficiency as other reference systems. That's what is meant for validation. Verification, it's more on a routine basis, as we have explained earlier. Verification relates to the comparison of daily data which have been already produced. Records can be obtained from the surveillance activity, in the case of official control, but within the company as well. Testing report of finished products, documentary reviews of food safety management system, measurement device, calibration for the measurement devices, reports of simulated risk control failure, etc., etc. There is different source of data and different origin of the data to be analyzed. The purpose of verification is to make sure that the system we have is effective and is effective day after day and contribute to the food safety management system. It's also useful to introduce an improvement in the event of a lack of control or incidents. We can use the accumulated daily data to correct and to improve the system. Conformity assessment techniques are used also. Inspection is very often used by competent authorities to monitor the food business establishments. For example, the checks in fishing vessels, the inspection of imported food and goods and live animals and plants, border inspection. That's one of the key areas of use, and I will give some details on border inspection in a different set of slides later on. Sampling and testing, sampling of goods at the border, sampling of goods on the marketplace, or sampling of commodity and goods at the warehouse. It's very important, and there was some discussion earlier between Professor Dedi and Carsten on sampling. It's a whole field of science. Actually, we can say science. Sampling, and it's particularly important in the field of aflatoxins. If you don't have a robust and sound sampling system, you can do how many tests that you like. You are not characterizing the well. You are not getting correct data. You are not getting relevant information on the level of contamination of aflatoxin in a batch or across the food chain. So it's really very demanding and very important for the competent authority to consider the characterization of aflatoxin, and that's particularly true for aflatoxin, but for many other contaminants, to consider how the sampling is done, and sampling and testing goes together, because there is a balance to find on characterizing the risk, characterizing how the hazard appear and flow across the food chain. And of course, we need lots of data. Sampling, testing is expensive, and we need to have lots of data, but there is a balance between the accuracy and the reliability of the sampling and testing model and the need to have accurate information to maintain, to reach the food safety objectives in the country and abroad. So this is really an area which we have to work on, and still in many countries, and I don't speak specifically for Indonesia, but in other countries, I have been working in Cambodia and Myanmar and Vietnam. It's always an issue which is still work in progress and which is subject to much improvement. So evaluation and other conformity assessment technique related to audit, but with the aim of issuing an evaluation report of pest, contaminants, etc. Certification, that's a point which is interesting. We have to be very careful here. Certification in the meaning of official controls had not the same meaning, absolutely not the same meaning as certification for ISO class scope. It's similar, but it's different. Issuance of health certificate by a competent authority is based on verification of past inspections of food business operator facilities. It's based on examination of shipment goods and their related documents. It's based on the inspection of goods to be shipped, and it's based on the testing of samples. This is different from, somewhat different from certification of products based on ISO 17065 or certification of food safety management system based on ISO that's 17021. That's slightly different. So we use the word certification. It has not the same meaning for of competent authorities and for certification bodies, third-party certification bodies who ensure certification on a voluntary basis of food safety management system or products. Inspection by public authorities, they are a basic tools for examining food business management of food and food safety. The aim in that context is to have an approach providing regulatory certainty and for addressing food risk in a consistent way and improving the food safety outcome across all the value chain. So for competent authorities, the question is, how do you ensure that you get the best outcome in terms of addressing food risk from the available resource? So the competent authorities should consider quality management principle for inspection system, which is based on ISO 17020, and because this principle can provide assurance that the inspection system are robust and responsive to change in the operating environment. Good public inspection systems are systems where the process and SOP are robust and consistent. They are systems when the implementation and outcomes are recorded, analyzed, and improved. These are systems where the inspector's performance is checked and maintained. So we see these are the core principles of the ISO standard for accrediting inspection system, but accreditation is not necessary for competent authority. Simply following ISO 17020 principle is good practice, and it allows the inspection body to be more effective and to be more cost effective. Basically, this is what we have when we establish a robust system. We have on the left-hand side inspectors' qualities. Inspector must be competent, and of course there are requisite and arrangement in the EU, in the Indonesia law as well as the EU law to have training for a person performing inspection. So the development of a cadre of competent inspectors allows the competent authority to be confident on the result of the inspection and their methods. So being confident, we can be satisfied that when we check compliance of food business operator, our practice will be sound, and we will make decisions which are consistent with legal requirement and standard benchmark. When we compare compliance of food business operator, our practice will be fair and effective, and we will work in a consistent way. So our implementation of risk management and the way we do this will be fair, consistent, and gives confidence to the industry targets. It means the food business operators in the industry can be confident and can trust the competent authority to make a decision which are in the best interest of all the value chain. It's not only the competent authority as opposed to operators, but it's rather the competent authority assisting the food chain and assisting the industry to perform better. So this is really the core principle for the competent authority and the inspection bodies, or the organization we perform inspection for the competent authority, is really to be the most efficient and the most effective possible, because the service they deliver helps the business to comply and helps the business to have better food safety outcome. So these are a few steps taken for the inspection as conformity assessment technique by the public authorities. They have to define the inspection approach. What needs to be done? And for solving what problem? So competent authority have many priorities, have many issues to tackle. And this is particularly true in the field of fisheries, because we have many products, we have different producing areas. So how will we organize the inspection approach across the different sub-parts of the supply chain, of the food chain? So we'll have to consider to apply controls and inspection for specific hazard at the most appropriate points in the food chain. And we have to check that this has been done according to the plan. The inspection approach has to be validated. As we have seen earlier, we have to validate a process. With this process, we want to produce certain results. So we have to validate the tools that we use to make sure that they are sufficient to provide, to deliver the result we want. This is called doing the right things. We have to make the inspection approach effective before we use it, or before we use it again next year. Then we have to verify the process, the inspection process, and the SOP. We have to do the things right. We have to make sure the competent authority have to make sure that the inspectors are doing the thing in the proper way and in the same way all across the country. And then after one period of practice of the inspection, we have to evaluate the outcome. Has the issue been solved or has the issue been improved? How could the inspection approach itself be improved in the next year or in the next period of several years? So you see, this is a strategy, or this is a principle of continuous improvement. We do things before we do, we validate, we accumulate data from the inspection, and we verify, we make sure that the inspection outcomes or our inspection approach has been effective, and we improve it for the future. So again, this is an approach which is recommended for public authorities, but there is nothing which prevents to associate private sector on this. Private sector are finally, they are the customers of the competent authority. Because the competent authority is here to facilitate and to help the industry to improve their food safety practice. So yes, it's a service delivery. And the competent authority provides a service for the industry. It's a regulatory service. So when the competent authority assess their performance after 1 year, after 2 years or 3 years, there is no reason why they should not share this assessment with the private sector. On the other hand, yes, the private sector is a partner. It's a kind of, it's a two-part of handshake. So the best practice is ensuring that there is no surprise for the food businesses being inspected. Nobody likes surprise. So food business should be satisfied. They should have knowledge on what will happen when they will be inspected, and they should be sure that the process is transparent and is supported by all the stakeholders in the food chain. Good preparation, good communication, informed on-site procedure and process, discuss of the findings and assuring the accuracy of the findings, conclusion and corrective action requirement, follow up with the food business operator for subsequent inspection, finalization of outstanding actions, and announce of the next scheduled inspection. These are a few key points that should be shared with food businesses, and that should be announced publicly when preparing the inspection cycle. I will not provide detail on a risk-based inspection, as we have been discussing, and Professor Dedi has highlighted this in this slide last week. Risk-based is a requirement, international requirement and good practice to develop inspection. There are several manuals from the Codex Alimentarius Commission to carry out risk analysis, to organize risk-based food inspection manual. And there is also guidance for governments on to apply HACCP principle in small or less developed food business. So now let me explain a little bit on how public authorities may organize their conformity assessment. They may cooperate with other public bodies, which is called, there's public bodies, there's public agency can be within the same hierarchy. This is called delegation. We can have another office or another department which is under the same ministry, and it can be decided that this body is in a better position to carry out official control and to carry out specific conformity assessment tasks. It can be inspection, it can be risk assessment, it can be testing, it can be sampling in the frame of regulatory official controls. It can be even in another ministry or hierarchy. So this is called conferment. It's very similar to delegation, but there is more detail and more administrative documentation on what are the expected results and what are the prerequisites and how the competent authority will ensure verification and control on the conferred body. But as you may be aware, competent authority may also transfer and delegate some of their conformity assessment to private bodies. It can be a certifier, it can be an inspection body, it can be a lab. This is called, this transfer of responsibility is called designation. In other countries, it's called recognition, and the bodies which have received this responsibility are called recognized bodies. Designation usually include two kinds of transfer. There is a designation, can be administrative. Okay, it's an administrative decision by which a competent authority transfer or delegate part of their responsibility to a private body. And of course, there is a listing and there is a list of recognized body, but designation also include technical designation. And this technical designation is made on a series of requirements of criteria that relate to the competence of the body. And typically, when a competent authority delegate the responsibility to a private body, very often they require that this private body is accredited for the conformity assessment technique, testing, inspection, or certification. I will give now a few examples on how this works. For example, the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa is working in collaboration with the relevant national authorities to develop a single harmonized food safety audit standards that is adapted to the local food chain and that assures an appropriate level of public health protection. So Consumer Goods Council, I don't know if you remember of the slides we had last week. It's an industry association. It's the largest retailer of consumer goods like Nestle, Migros, what we had also, Metro, Olam, many others. So in that case, all these large food operators, they are developing a single framework for food safety audit. That's auditing of food safety management system across the food supply chain. So they will use these standards across all the food business in their industry association, and they work, they cooperate with competent authority for food so that there is a recognition between the industry and the competent authority that if this food safety standard is properly used by a certified certification body or auditing body, then the competent authority can be satisfied that the body which has been audited using this standard are in conformity with the regulation. So there will be no need for additional inspection, or the food business should be considered in a lower risk category, so the competent authority can have less frequent or less severe audits when considering the result of the use of these private food safety audit standards. So this is still being developed according to my information, but it's a principle and it's an approach which is increasingly used in many countries. We have another example very near Indonesia. Very recently, there was I think it's in 2019, there was a revision of the New Zealand Food Act. The previous Food Act was from 2013, and there was no provision for competent authority of using private sectors. So in the 2019 revision, the legislator has introduced a new wording, and it's called food control agent. And food control agent, nowhere in the new act do they mention whether it's a private body or public body. So it simply says that the legislator, the person, the authority in charge of implementing the Food Act, have to rely on food control agent, and of course the responsibility and capability of this food control agent are well defined in the Act. But whether it's a private body or a public body, this is entirely not specified. It means that the department in charge of enforcing the law is free to choose. Either they use a public body, and in Australia it can be a local food safety agency, it can be a veterinary office, it could be, but it can also be a private sector body, provided that they comply with the requirement stated for in the law. Another example is in the United States of America, the Food and Drug Authority, under the new Food Safety Modification Act, has totally delegated the certification of food safety management system to private third-party certification bodies. The Food Safety Modernization Act, finally, I think it was in 2010 or 11, if my memory is still working well. Basically, the introduction of this act was the recognition, introduced the recognition that the focus of food safety shifted from the regulator. The regulatory was shifted to the private business. And it was a little bit similar to the EU approach. Business were made responsible to follow the regulation and the criteria developed by the FDA. The way they follow, they were free to use whatever tools and whatever method. Of course, the FDA was proposing some guidance based on the HACCP and GMP, etc., but it was not a requirement. And the food business were also left free to either certify or self-certify or use any kind of certification based on the use of private certification bodies. What does the FDA is that they verify and they require any food business to be able to demonstrate that they have implemented this kind of conformity assessment. They must demonstrate that they have a certificate from any private or public or etc. So basically the work of the FDA is to ensure to verify that the regulation has been properly implemented. This was started by official control for farm fishery products, and it has been extended to other products. And USDA, US Department of Agriculture, has adopted a similar approach and it has recognized the outcome of voluntary third-party certification program for the good agricultural practice and good husbandry practice, which means that any producer which has a certification on GAP or GHP by a private body is considered as compliant by USDA to the agricultural food code which has been adopted. And we see that there are similar arrangements which are used also in the ASEAN Economic Community. In Singapore, this has been in place for import certification of produce. It's entirely based on third-party certification, and the third-party certificates are accepted by the official controls at the border. In Malaysia, there is also recognition and designation of private certifiers to ensure GAP and organic certification. It's also the case in the Philippines. There is a wide range of private bodies which are recognized and listed, but they have, Philippines has developed very detailed requirement for the bodies in charge of certifying organic and GAP product for recognition and official compliance. And they also maintain, of course, a list of recognized bodies, and it's updated, and it's you can find this on the website of the PhilGAP and on the website of the Bureau of Plant Industry of the Ministry of Agriculture. And Vietnam also has started to develop certification of authorization of the use of private certifier for food and vegetable compliance to good agricultural practice, but this is less advanced, but it's the same principle which is working. So this is my presentation on the different ways of conformity, how conformity assessment techniques are used in regulation controls. Basically, what we can remember, the takeaway of this presentation is that there is an international definition of terms and methods of conformity assessment techniques. This is given by ISO-CASCO, and this is always a useful reference on how to organize the nuts and bolts of conformity assessment. These practice and these methods are applied in a specific ways when determining of food safety management system, either on the voluntary sector or in the mandatory sectors by competent authority. It's not necessary for all the bodies involved in official controls to be accredited, and it's acceptable for an inspection body to be not to be accredited, but it's a matter of best practice and effectiveness. Inspection body that follows the principle of ISO 17025 or 020 will be much more efficient and much more responsive, and so they will contribute better to achieve food safety outcomes. In the same way, public laboratories do not need to be accredited to the ISO 17025 standard. But the key question for a public laboratory involved in the testing of food for official control is, are my results reliable? Can I deliver results which are trusted by the competent authority and by the exporter? And will these results be opposable, or will they be recognized by the the competent authority in the importing countries like the EU, or even it can be Japan, or it can be wherever. So this is a key question, and we see that even if you are not accredited, if the laboratory has no sufficient calibration no validated method, no competent staff, and no traceability, it's impossible for them to provide a reliable result and results which are recognized. So finally, we see that the principle of good, effective, competent authority must be adopted even in the case of public use and public implementation of conformity assessment techniques. And this is what we learn, that nowadays competent authorities, they can use private bodies, private certification, private labs, or private inspection bodies when they are accredited, because they will be sure that if they use accredited bodies delivering conformity assessment services, their result will be acceptable and their result will be reliable. So the official control will be based on safe and sound data and safe and sound outcome of conformity assessment. So for the competent authority, for the official control body, it's entirely a matter of managing the implementation of official controls. Either they can do it themselves by following good, effective principle of implementation of inspection and laboratory, or they can transpose to private sector on the same basis by making sure that their delegated body or their recognized body are working according to the principle of international effectiveness as described in the international standards. So thank you very much. This is the end of my slide on conformity assessment. I will handle over the screen and the speech to the host for the next presentation.
Baik, terima kasih Mr. Allen untuk paparannya. Selanjutnya di chatroom ada pertanyaan dari Ibu Purwaningsih dari KKP. Nah, masih ada Ibu Purwaningsih? Ini bertanya mengenai risk management. Dalam risk management ada intraspesies yang menjadi variabelnya antara anak-anak dan orang dewasa saja. Apakah orang lanjut usia tidak termasuk di dalamnya?
Perlu disampaikan buat lain kali ya.
Yes, sorry, I have been listening, but I am not clear about the question.
Apakah ada Ibu Purwaningsih di sini? Mungkin bisa diperjelas untuk pertanyaan di chatroom-nya. Atau mungkin kita ke pertanyaan berikut dulu, Alen, untuk pertanyaan dari Ibu Raffi Faras mengenai kebijakan Green Deal Uni Eropa. Banyak artikel dan berita yang membahas kekhawatiran kebijakan Green Deal. Apakah bakal sia-sia misalnya Green Deal berjalan atas rencana penyelesaian perjanjian EU-CEPA? Apakah EU-CEPA terhambat dengan adanya kebijakan Green Deal? Karena sudah cukup lama belum ada kesepakatan dalam EU-CEPA.
Honestly, I am not well familiar with this. What is the EU-CEPA? Yeah, this is a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. Okay, let me gather my mind. Ah, yes, IAU. No, yes, of course. I mean, well, let me. I cannot go much into the detail of this question, but basically, what we see here is the increased level of awareness and concern of the EU and North American consumers on the impact of food safety system on the climate change. And it's recurrent, it's very, it's a concern. Climate change is a concern which is high on the agenda of EU association and worldwide also, but to the point that EU now is stepping up, and there is an alignment between the food safety policy and the sustainability of food. It's a nexus between the impact of food and maintaining food safety, maintaining food availability, food security, at the same time not avoiding to have too strong impact on the environment and climate change. So this is a new trend which is being translated from the level of awareness and preoccupation into policy first. So that's why we have the Green Deal policy. And now, since it's a policy, an EU policy, it has to be implemented. And the implementation of a policy will take the form of several regulation or a decision by the Council. You remember that a decision is more giving an orientation and leaving a time frame of 5 or 6 years to the member states to adapt themselves. Regulation will be enforceable immediately. So this regulation on deforestation impact is one of the first examples of how the Green Deal policy will be implemented. And yes, of course, everything which will be done in the CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and in the framework of the cooperation between the ASC bloc and the EU, will have to be in conformity with this Green Deal policy. Now, of course, there may be, in the way the regulations are implemented, there may be specific flexibility arrangement. There may be specific subsector that will be excluded for a given time of the regulatory field. I am not. I think it's very early in the time of the. I think the forest regulation will come into effect on 1st January 2022. And it's the same way as in another example I could give is the regulation on the new Organic Act of the EU. Now the EU has decided to raise the level of requirement. In the past, there was a high level of requirement for EU producers, and the third country producer had more flexibility. Now, starting 2022 January, the organic requirement will be the same for imports and nationally produced product. But this regulation will have to be implemented progressively, and there may be a way and discussion, negotiation within the blocks on how this will take place and at the speed may be adapted. Or honestly, there is no information on this for the time being. This definitely will take place also at the level of the policy dialogue between Indonesia and the EU. And as you know, Arise Plus is one technical program which is in charge to improve the nuts and bolts of the cooperation. But there is also a component on trade policy and trade defense and trade mechanism, which is supported by Arise and other projects of the EU. So I'm sorry for the person. I am not a specialist in this specific area. what I can tell you that this kind of disposition and regulation, you will have more and more of these in the future, and there will be ways and there will be specific arrangement between Indonesia and the EU to implement this gradually so that the effect is not too heavy on the Indonesia exporters.
Mbak Widi.
Oke, thank you Mr. Allen. Dari Prof. Dedi, apakah ada tambahan untuk pertanyaan mengenai Green Deal tadi ataupun pertanyaan sebelumnya ya?
Enggak, saya kira nggak ada ya. Saya nggak
Iya.
memahami.
Iya. Ya. Tadi Ibu Purwaningsih kayaknya juga mungkin sedang ini ya berhalangan untuk ini mikrofon atau bagaimana. Baik, terima kasih Prof. Dedi dan Mr. Allen. Apakah dari Bapak Ibu ada pertanyaan atau hal untuk didiskusikan terkait materi hari ini?
Selamat sore.
Halo.
Ya.
Saya
dengan
juga
Pak Raffi ya?
Pak Raffi, ya.
Ya,
Saya mau
silakan Pak
nanya
Raffi.
ke Prof. Dedi ya. Itu gimana ya Pak ya? Kebijakan Green Deal dengan kebijakan perjanjian EU CEPA ini yang antara Indonesia dan Uni Eropa itu loh Pak.
Ini saya
Tanggapan
mengatakan
Bapak gimana ya?
Saya mengatakan saya tidak aware dan tidak mengetahui dengan jelas. Saya bukan bidangnya. Saya kira mungkin kawan-kawan dari Kementerian Perdagangan kali ya, ada yang mengetahui itu. Mohon maaf saya tidak tune in di sini.
Itu terima kasih Pak untuk
Ya, terima kasih.
Pak Dedi dan Mr. Allen tadi.
Ya baik Pak Raffi, mungkin sebetulnya kemarin kita ada juga mengundang dari Kemendak, cuman saya kurang tahu juga apakah ada yang hadir di sini seperti itu. Untuk Bapak Ibu yang lain, apakah ada pertanyaan atau ada diskusi?
Saya sebetulnya ada presentasi lagi Bu, Pak Widi.
Oke, Prof. Dedi, silakan Prof.
Nanti pertanyaan di belakang aja ya.
Boleh.
Ya. Baik, saya mulai ya. Saya share screen. Kelihatan?
Iya, terlihat.
Okay. Baik, I think Mr. Allen previously already explained the rationale on conformity assessment applied in EU. What I would like to do now is just to explain how Indonesia through BSN and Committee Accreditation Nasional apply this conformity assessment. Jadi saya hanya singkat saja ini bagaimana kita menerapkan skim dari conformity assessment di Indonesia. Penting sekali bahwa ini dimulai dari adanya law and government regulation sebetulnya. Selalu kita mulai dari legislasi ya. Jadi terkait dengan Undang-Undang Nomor 20 Tahun 2014 terkait dengan standardisasi dan conformity assessment. Jadi memang sudah diundang-undangkan. Kemudian setelah itu ada turunannya, yaitu peraturan pemerintah nomor 34 tahun 2018 terkait juga dengan National Standardization and Conformity Assessment System. Jadi tadi yang disampaikan Alain itu yang dilaksanakan di EU dan kemudian dijelaskan juga basic principles ya, kemudian rasional dan macam-macam lagi. Saya kira itu penting sekali untuk diketahui tadi. Kemudian juga ada keputusan Presiden nomor 4 2016 terkait dengan pembentukan BSN. Ini penting juga sebagai legislasi dari pembentukan standardisasi dan conformity assessment ini. Dan kemudian juga ada SK atau keputusan dari Kepala BSN tentang organisasi yang sudah kita kenal sekarang, bagaimana BSN terbentuk organisasinya. Dan sebetulnya BSN ini adalah badan memang non-ministerial government institution, badan bukan kementerian yang bertanggung jawab dalam tugas-tugas standarisasi, conformity assessment, akreditasi, dan metrologi. Jadi 4 kata-kata ini memang menjadi bagian tanggung jawab daripada BSN. Dan memang dari sejak lama BSN sudah ada di tahun 97 dan kemudian berubah-ubah karena adanya peraturan-peraturan, termasuk keputusan Presiden tahun 2000 itu terkait dengan pembentukan semua LPND waktu disebutnya waktu itu. Baik, sudah tentu mengapa dibentuk, ada tujuannya, yaitu untuk mengakses ya, kebijakan nasional terkait dengan standarisasi, penilaian kesesuaian, akreditasi, dan metrologi di Indonesia. Saya kira sangat spesifik tugasnya. Kemudian mengkoordinasikan program-program activity yang dilaksanakan di bawah tugas-tugas BSN tersebut. Kemudian mempercepat sudah tentu dan memberdayakan stakeholders dalam menerapkan, melaksanakan program-program nasional terkait dengan standarisasi, conformity assessment, atau penilaian kesesuaian, akreditasi, dan metrologi di Indonesia. Saya kira to the point, jelas sekali tugasnya, fungsinya. Kemudian membuat suatu kesepakatan, koordinasi nasional dengan internasional dalam rangka kegiatan tersebut. Dan sudah tentu melakukan, menyelenggarakan promosi terkait dengan itu, kemudian melakukan riset-riset, membangun capacity building, karena ini sangat diperlukan, ya, riset dan capacity building, termasuk juga yang lain-lain terkait dengan standarisasi, penilaian kesesuaian, akreditasi, dan metodologi. Dan BSN juga merupakan lembaga notifikasi dan inquiry point untuk kegiatan-kegiatan terkait dengan TBT maupun kesepakatan WTO. Jadi itu sebagai perwakilan. Nah, dikatakan di sini bahwa tugas dan tanggung jawab daripada aktivitas terkait dengan penilaian kesesuaian dan akreditasi itu dilaksanakan oleh KAN. Jadi sudah ada pembagian tugas yang jelas antara BSN dengan National Accreditation Body. Ini hanya memperjelas saja dari artikel-artikel yang ada dalam undang-undang tersebut. Ya, ini terkait dengan, saya tidak akan bacakan, tapi intinya adalah artikel 3 terkait dengan standarisasi dan conformity assessment, apa tujuannya? Ya, saya kira jelas sekali di sini untuk memperbaiki jaminan kualitas, ya, kemudian efisiensi produksi, dan kemudian daya saing nasional dan seterusnya. Ya. Kemudian juga yang kedua sangat penting untuk meningkatkan perlindungan terhadap konsumen, terhadap bisnis, terhadap buruh, dan yang lain-lain. Dan kemudian memperbaiki kepastian. Nah, ini juga kepastian, kelancaran, efisiensi, dan seterusnya. Ini adalah diuraikan pada artikel 3. Artikel keempatnya jelas sekali bahwa standarisasi dan penilaian kesesuaian ini diaplikasikan, dilaksanakan baik untuk barang, jasa, sistem, proses, maupun personal. Jadi sudah jelas apa target-target daripada conformity assessment dan standarisasi ini. Artikel 8, pemerintah melaksanakan tugas dan tanggung jawab di bidang ini, ya, standarisasi dan penilaian kesesuaian. Kemudian dan seterusnya dijelaskan di sini tugas-tugasnya dibagi, ya, di sini dilaksanakan oleh BSN, kemudian BSN dan seterusnya bertanggung jawab langsung kepada Presiden, ya, melalui menteri-menteri koordinasi yang terkait. Dan saya tidak akan bacakan, tapi intinya adalah artikel 9 kaitannya dengan ini kaitannya dengan KAN. Jadi sudah ada pembagian tugas artikel 8 untuk BSN dan artikel 9 untuk KAN. Sama-sama KAN juga adalah lembaga non-kementerian yang langsung bertanggung jawab pada Presiden, tapi melalui kepala BSN. Kira-kira itu pembagiannya, sehingga jelas sekali apa tugasnya. Nah, ini saya ambil dari presentasinya Pak Kuku waktu sebelum jadi kepala BSN. Dan ini sangat jelas sekali bagaimana kaitannya antara BSN yang mengembangkan standar dan kemudian KAN yang terkait dengan Conformity Assessment, termasuk akreditasi, dan NMI ini dengan metodologi. Kelihatan bagaimana keterkaitan kelembagaan dalam rangka dalam rangka melakukan tugasnya masing-masing. Jadi kalau kita lihat terkait dengan Conformity Assessment, maka di bawahnya di KAN ini itu adalah yang kemudian ada lembaga-lembaga yang diakreditasi oleh KAN di sini. Ya. Jadi KAN tugasnya mengakreditasi lembaga-lembaga penilaian kesesuaian di sini, baik pemerintah maupun private, yang nantinya akan melakukan secara tentu audit kepada industri. Itu kira-kira secara singkat uraian daripada kelembagaan ini dalam rangka melakukan kegiatan standarisasi dan conformity assessment, termasuk metodologi. Nah ini kalau kita kaitkan dengan akreditasi dan sistem sertifikasi, saya juga ambil daripada presentasinya Pak Kuku yang dulu, tapi ini jelas sekali di sini menggambarkan bahwa KAN ini itu adalah mengakreditasi lembaga sertifikasi. Kalau saya lihat, kalau kita lihat, saya akan berikan gambaran di sini. Ini ada 3 yang diakreditasi oleh KAN, yaitu adalah certification body, ya, di sini. Kemudian ada inspection body dan ada laboratorium. Jadi ada 3 lembaga itulah yang kemudian diakreditasi di situ. Ya. Kemudian apa yang disertifikasi, ya, di sini ada kaitannya dengan sertifikasi personal, kemudian ada QMS di sini, ada sertifikasi produk, ada sertifikasi IMS, dan ada HACCP, ya. Dan ke bawahnya dilihat di sini bagaimana cara-cara mensertifikasi tersebut, ya. Kemudian dilaksanakanlah di industri. Nah, kemudian kalau dengan laboratorium kaitannya dengan di sini kemudian ada 2 di sini, kebetulan di sini kalibrasi, testing dan kalibrasi laboratorium pengujian dan laboratorium kalibrasi, dan kemudian laboratorium kesehatan, ya. Semua terkait dengan dasarnya juga, ya. Yang ketiga adalah inspection body. Nah, ini menarik sekali inspection body. Tadi Alain mengatakan kalau di Amerika, New Zealand itu ada inspection body, ada third party untuk melakukan inspeksi. Yang saya tahu bahwa waktu saya ke New Zealand, memang New Zealand itu sangat sedikit orangnya, kemudian mereka banyak membutuhkan inspection body dari luar yang sudah tentu kerjasama dengan pemerintah, dengan Ministry of Primary Industry, ya, situ. Dan kemudian tugas yang lainnya adalah melakukan providing akreditasi untuk provider provision testing. Itu adalah skema-skema yang ada di dalam KAN. Saya singkat aja. Kemudian dari sini kelihatan bahwa apa yang dilakukan oleh KAN dalam rangka mengakreditasi certification body, laboratory, dan inspection body itu adalah terkait dengan dasarnya seperti apa. Nah, saya beri tanda di sini yang kaitannya dengan pangan. Ya. Pertama, mungkin saya kira yang kaitannya dengan pangan adalah Quality Management System Certification Agency, ya. Lembaga yang terkait dengan sertifikasi Quality Management System ini, ya. Itu dasarnya sudah ada di sini, tentu dasarnya ISO 9001 ya, dan ISO yang lain ya di sini. Kemudian yang kedua adalah Environmental Management System Certificate Agency ya. Ini untuk lingkungan. Kemudian, nah ini saya berikan juga tebal, ini kaitannya juga dengan pangan. Ada HACCP di sini, Certification Body ya. Kemudian juga ini Food Safety Management System Certification Agency, ini juga sama terkait dengan pangan ya. Yang lainnya saya kira singkat saja, ini kaitannya dengan sistem manajemen security ya, informasi dan seterusnya. Kemudian quality management system certificate agency ya, untuk medical devices, ini untuk sertifikasi personel, sertifikasi produk dan yang lainnya yang tadi saya sampaikan pada chart sebelumnya. Kemudian juga ada yang lainnya dan termasuk lembaga sertifikasi sistem manajemen energi. Ada juga halal di sini, sertifikasi body ada di sini, testing laboratory, inspection agency, medical laboratory dan seterusnya. Nah ini apa-apa yang dilaksanakan, skema-skema akreditasi yang dilaksanakan oleh KAN tersebut. Nah, saya menyarankan saja, saya tidak akan menjelaskan secara detail karena tugas daripada BSN dan KAN ya, terkait dengan standardisasi dan conformity assessment. Cuma saja saya mungkin hanya ingin menjelaskan bagaimana proses akreditasi dilakukan di bawah KAN tersebut. Sudah ada gambarnya, kalau saya ingin jelaskan, mungkin ini untuk akreditasi laboratorium, kemudian lembaga sertifikasi, kemudian ada lembaga inspeksi. Pertama, sudah tentu ada aplikasi dari yang bersangkutan, lembaga yang bersangkutan kepada direktur dari KAN tersebut, aplikasi nomor 1. Kemudian nanti setelah diusulkan, dievaluasi, kemudian sudah tentu ada penugasan terhadap asesor, kemudian membentuk tim di situ, kemudian melakukan assessment atau surveillance atau reassessment, tergantung daripada tujuan daripada assessment tersebut. Ya. Kemudian nanti jelas sekali hasilnya akan dikembalikan kepada direktur dari KAN sebagai report di situ, kemudian nanti akan dibahas dan sudah tentu diperlukan technical advice dari grup tertentu, ya, kemudian dilakukan komunikasi dan kemudian hasilnya dikembalikan ke KAN dan kemudian dari situ barulah diberikan akreditasinya. Ini adalah suatu flow yang sudah to the point ya, simple, tapi saya kira memerlukan upaya-upaya untuk bisa melaksanakannya karena dibutuhkan banyak dokumen-dokumen untuk bisa melaksanakan. Dan sebagaimana disarankan dalam web tersebut, Anda boleh juga mendownload website tersebut, bisa mempelajari proses ini melewati video. Saya kira ini BSN KAN ini suatu lembaga yang sangat bagus sekali dalam rangka mempromosikan semua kegiatannya. Semua ada di web dan semua mudah untuk diunduh dan kemudian bisa dipelajari. Banyak sekali informasi yang ada di situ. Bagaimana menerapkan conformity assessment, bagaimana menyiapkan laboratorium, kemudian bagaimana menyiapkan yang lainnya yang diperlukan dalam akreditasi tersebut. Nah, ini penting bahwa KAN sudah diakui internasional, ada international recognition kepada KAN. Jadi KAN mewakili Indonesia dalam forum kerjasama internasional antar badan akreditasi, yaitu dengan IAF, International Accreditation Forum, kemudian dengan ILAC, International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, dan dengan Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation. Jadi memang ini sudah lama kerjasama ini dibangun dan saling pengakuan di antara ketiga lembaga internasional tersebut. Fokus kerjasama yang dilakukan adalah penting, perjanjian saling pengakuan. Nah, ini saya kira bagus ya, perjanjian saling pengakuan ya, atas hasil-hasil sertifikasi pengujian, inspeksi, ya, dan lain-lain yang saya sebutkan tadi, ya, disebut sebagai multilateral recognition agreements atau mutual recognition arrangement. Itu yang mana aja, tapi itu menggambarkan bahwa itu saling pengakuan di antara lembaga ini. Nah, Anda boleh bertanya nanti ke Uni Eropa, mungkin bagaimana ini hubungannya dengan IAF, ILAC, APAC ini, dengan kaitannya dengan sistem apa namanya Conformity Assessment di Uni Eropa. Jadi jelas sekali bahwa kalau ada MLA dan MRE, maka mereka akan saling mengakui satu sama lain atas sertifikat dan laporan yang diterbitkan oleh lembaga kesesuaian tadi. Sudah tentu keuntungan dari saling pengakuan tersebut adalah mengurangi potensi dilakukannya resertifikasi, ya, jangan ulang-ulang gitu ya, atau dilakukan pemeriksaan ulang terhadap barang, jasa, ketika ada traffic atau perpindahan barang dari satu negara ke negara lain. Nah, ini yang sebetulnya yang penting sebetulnya dari pengakuan tersebut. Nah, mungkin untuk Eropa mungkin perlu didiskusikan dengan istilah lain bagaimana sih sebetulnya pengakuan-pengakuan tersebut diaplikasikan di Uni Eropa. Saya kira ini hanya tanda aja ya, bagaimana ditangani antara MRE, antara CAN dengan APLAC maupun ILAC di sini, ya, untuk testing laboratori, untuk laboratori kalibrasi, untuk medical laboratori dan lembaga inspeksi, termasuk juga untuk MRE dengan ILAC. Sama juga di sini adalah kerjasama CAN dengan PAC, ya, dan IAF, ya, terkait dengan produk certification, terkait dengan IMS, dan lain-lain. Ini menggambarkan bahwa memang kan sudah bekerja sama dengan mereka-mereka secara internasional, dan itu menguntungkan bagi para pelaku usaha agar supaya memang dengan melakukan penilaian kesesuaian melalui sertifikasi body nanti bisa diakui di luar. Mungkin hanya tambahan saja, jadi saya katakan tadi bahwa informasi ini sangat lengkap. Jadi semua bisa di-download, bisa dipelajari, dan bisa diisi kalau Anda mau melakukan akreditasi atau mau melakukan penilaian kesesuaian dan sebagainya. Jadi saya tidak akan sampaikan detail, tapi ini adalah informasi yang bisa di-download di situ terkait dengan Conformity Assessment di Indonesia. Kalau ini saya kira hanya untuk menjelaskan bagaimana proses standarisasi SNI oleh BSN. Ini mirip-mirip Codex yang saya sampaikan dulu ya, bagaimana suatu standar diusulkan dari mulai perencanaan sama ya, ada drafting, dibuat konsepnya, konsensus, kemudian disampaikan kepada public comment, mungkin di upload di sini, kemudian seterusnya ya, sampai akhirnya dijadikan suatu standar dan kemudian di maintenance, dipelihara, dirawat. Sama awalnya dari mana? Dari kebutuhan dari pelaku usaha atau kebutuhan dari stakeholders di sini. Kemudian pada saat planning diusulkan di sini usulan, kemudian di drafting, diverifikasi dan seterusnya ya, saya tidak akan bacakan, tapi ini intinya adalah suatu proses yang harus dilewati sampai nanti standar itu dijadikan sebagai standar SNI. Kalau sudah jadi, kemudian nanti dipublikasi dan kemudian direview dan kemudian dipelihara bagaimana standar tersebut diaplikasikan. Dan ini mungkin penting bahwa compliant dengan standar SNI adalah baik untuk barang, jasa, proses, sistem maupun personal. Ya. Jadi kalau sudah comply, maka semua itu akan memperoleh Certificate of Compliance dengan mendapatkan tanda SNI sudah tentu. Jadi logo SNI adalah menjadi bagian pengakuan sebagai Certificate of Compliance. Kemudian kegiatan penilaian kesesuaiannya yang comply dengan SNI tersebut dilaksanakan oleh KAN. Jadi ada kerjasama terkait, BSN membuat standarisasi, mengembangkan standarisasi SNI, tapi KAN kemudian melakukan penilaian kesesuaiannya, ya, dan mengakreditasi lembaga yang menilai kesesuaian tersebut, menilai lembaga atau certification body tadi. Kemudian mengakui kompetensi dari lembaga tersebut, ya, untuk dalam rangka kegiatan-kegiatan kerjasama bilateral maupun multilateral sebagai bagian dari persetujuan pengakuan dengan prinsip-prinsip sudah tentu timbal balik, ya, reciprocal. Kemudian compliance terhadap mandatory SNI itu juga dilakukan dengan melewatikan, ya, di sini, ya, dan seterusnya. Jadi saya kira ini jelas. Saya ingin mengatakan bahwa standarisasi dan conformity assessment adalah dua bagian yang sangat penting dalam kaitannya dengan perdagangan. Terutama kita sedang membicarakan sekarang ini adalah kaitannya dalam ekspor produk pangan ke Uni Eropa. Nah, itu kira-kira yang disampaikan, singkat saja. Jadi saya hanya lebih banyak lebih banyak pada bagaimana kita menerapkan conformity assessment di Indonesia. Tadi Mr. Allen sudah menjelaskan secara komprehensif bagaimana dasar-dasar pengembangan daripada conformity assessment tersebut. Nah, saya diminta juga untuk menyampaikan suatu studi kasus tentang rejection dari food product oleh EU. Tadi siang hari saya menyampaikan notifikasi dari RAFS, tapi ini adalah suatu paper yang kami susun dengan mahasiswa, ya, yang sudah mahasiswa program doktor Anugroho dari Badan POM. Kami menyusun satu paper waktu itu, prioritasi dari pasangan pangan patogen terkait dengan penolakan ekspor dalam produk fishery. Ini menarik karena kita mengkaji secara mendalam, ya, di sini, dan ini publikasi sudah dipublikasikan di Food Control. Kebetulan memang publikasinya tahun 2022 sebetulnya, karena memang mereka antri dan ini baru dipublikasikan tahun 2022, tapi sudah diterima sebagai publikasi. Nah, pendekatannya adalah bahwa kami melakukan risk ranking dan kemudian melakukan prioritasi, gitu ya. Mengapa itu dilakukan? Karena risiko itu kan bisa terjadi karena health risk sama economic risk. Health risk terkait dengan keamanan pangan, ya, dengan kesehatan. Kalau economic risk terkait dengan penolakan ekspor, juga terkait dengan kehilangan dana dan sebagainya, ya. Dan kemudian kita mencoba membuat prioritasi, dan dengan demikian itu bisa digunakan untuk follow up nantinya apa yang harus kita lakukan dalam rangka mencegah hal seperti ini, mencegah refusal atau mengurangi refusal daripada ekspor tadi. Ini konsepnya saja, bahwa yang kami lakukan adalah membuat perbandingan, meranking, ya, antara severity, antara keparahan dari suatu masalah, ya, terkait dengan kesehatan, dan kejadiannya, keseringan kejadian di sini, likelihood, ya, kejadian. Dengan memplotkan tersebut, maka kita bisa melihat bahwa kalau pasangan daripada bahaya dan pangan tersebut berada pada pojok kanan, itu merupakan risiko yang paling tinggi, ya, baik dari segi kesehatan atau dari segi ekonomi kalau kita memasukkan itu sebagai bagian daripada kajian. Baik, saya akan coba meneruskan memperjelas kenapa sampai terjadi kotak ini. Nah, ini adalah caranya. Jadi ini pertama kita screening informasi semua dari literatur, semua dari laporan-laporan terkait dengan ekspor, terkait dengan penolakan ekspor, terkait dengan reimport dan sebagainya. Itu data semua dikumpulkan dan cukup banyak di sini. Ada ratusan ribu data, kemudian ada rekodnya berapa, yang terjadi yang bisa dikumpulkan. Kita menggunakan meta analisis, kemudian di screening, akhirnya rekodnya berkurang dan akhirnya ada beberapa rekod yang dibuang dan digunakan untuk analisis. Ya, ini flow-nya saja bagaimana dilakukan penelitian ini. Nah, ini data yang ditemukan, ya, jadi data penolakan ekspor terkait dengan banyak produk, ya, terutama di sini terkait dengan hasil perikanan studi. Yang merah ini adalah kaitannya dengan microbial hazard, ya, dan pasangannya. Jadi jelas sekali di sini pasangannya adalah misalkan udang salmonella, ya, ada 36 kasus, kemudian tuna salmonella ada 32. Jadi kami sudah memilah-pilah pasangan-pasangan tersebut penolakan. Jadi nanti kelihatan penyebabnya apa. Jadi penyebabnya adalah bahaya salmonella pada udang atau salmonella pada tuna. Ya. Itu untuk yang bahaya mikrobiologi. Contoh lain misalkan salmonella pada mahi-mahi, itu juga diperoleh datanya. Ya. Kemudian ada salmonella pada snapper. Ada sebelah kiri Listeria monocytogenes pada tuna, itu ada juga temuannya. Ada penolakan, tapi memang relatif sedikit kejadiannya. Ada lagi virus hepatitis E pada tuna. Ya. Kemudian ada juga E. coli pada udang, coliform pada tuna, dan seterusnya. Ini pada merah-merah ini kaitannya dengan mikrobial. Tapi juga data diperoleh juga terkait dengan non-mikrobial. Non-mikrobial termasuk chemical, antara lain merkuri pada swordfish, merkuri pada marlin, histamin pada tuna, ya. Kemudian penggunaan karbon monoksida di tuna, kemudian poor temperature control pada tuna. Nah, tadi disebutkan bahwa ini adalah satu risk factor bahwa pengendalian temperatur suhu yang jelek gitu akan menimbulkan banyak masalah terkait dengan juga histamin. Kaitannya dengan labeling, dengan kadmium pada marlin, kadmium pada oktopus. Tadi kita lihat di siang hari, saya menyampaikan tolakan dari EURAFS antara lain karena oktopus, ya, di situ juga. Baik, dari situ dengan demikian maka kami bisa memilah-milah mana yang pasangan bahaya dengan ikan, microbial hazard, mana yang chemical. Nah, yang dilaporkan sekarang adalah yang terkait dengan microbial hazard. Yang terkait dengan pasangan kimia sudah jadi papernya, sedang akan disampaikan pada suatu publisher nanti. Saya tidak tahu, mungkin juga food control lagi, karena approach-nya mirip-mirip. Nah, dari situ kita melakukan suatu decision tree, ya, untuk memilih mana yang akan dikeluarkan dari ranking, mana yang akan dimasukkan ke dalam ranking. Nah, ini semuanya sudah saya sampaikan pada pelatihan training sebelumnya. Training kerjasama Badan POM dengan EURAFS, dengan EURISE yang saya, ya, dalam rangka training mengembangkan risk ranking dan prioritasi. Jadi ini bagian daripada hasil pelatihan adalah salah satunya adalah ini. Jadi dari melakukan suatu decision tree ini, maka kemudian dapatlah suatu tabel di sini. Nah, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 sampai 6 ini adalah jawaban. Jawabannya di bawah, ini pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang harus dijawab. Sudah biasa kalau menggunakan decision tree ada seperti itu. Ada pertanyaan, ada jawaban. Sama halnya dengan kalau kita melakukan decision tree untuk HACCP lah kira-kira. Nah, dari sini kemudian ada konklusi mana yang dievaluasi nanti yang masuk kategori yang akan di ranking itu adalah misalkan salmonella dalam anchovy yang yes, salmonella mahi-mahi itu yes, ya. Yang yes itu yang kemudian dimasukkan ke dalam kajian berikutnya. Di mana dalam kajian berikutnya itu dihitung berapa besar burden atau beban yang diakibatkan oleh pasangan ini terhadap kesehatan. Itu dihitung dan kemudian nanti diplotkan dalam satu matriks tadi. Oke, ringkasnya bahwa dari situ kemudian kami bisa menyusun hubungan antara potensial loss ya dari ekspor ini dalam dollars ya di absis ya dengan total ekspor ya di sini. Nah, kalau kita hitung hanya ini hubungan ini dua, maka ternyata yang paling besar potensial loss dan total ekspor dibandingkan dengan total ekspornya adalah Salmonella shrimp. Pasangan itu yang kemudian paling besar. Yang ternyata emang itu ditolak gitu ya. Itu memberikan dampak ekonomik yang cukup luas. Jadi dari kajian ini, case study ini kita bisa melihat bahwa Salmonella shrimp itu memberikan dampak yang cukup luas secara ekonomi maupun secara kesehatan ya. Nah, kita lihat di sini kalau warnanya tua gitu ya. Jadi ada di pojok kanan ya. Makin ke kiri ke bawah itu makin kurang dampaknya. Nah, kemudian contoh lain misalkan saja. Ini dilihat dari kalau kita hubungkan antara kajian antara berat besi dari ekspor tersebut dibandingkan dengan jumlah yang masuk rumah sakit. Jadi kaitannya adalah dengan kesehatan kan. Kaitannya dengan economic risk dengan kesehatan. Itu ternyata Salmonella tuna pasangan itu. Salmonella udang juga ada di sini di atas. Jadi kita bisa membeda-bedakan bagaimana pendekatan kita dan kita bisa akan melakukan mana yang paling berisiko dari semua itu, dari pasangan tersebut. Ini contoh ada Salmonella tuna, ada Listeria masuk di sini, ya. Kemudian shrimp Salmonella. Ini kalau dikaitkan dengan kematian, memang kematian ada sedikit ya. Dan biasanya kalau Listeria kan bahayanya cukup tinggi ya, dianggap cukup berisiko, lah dibandingkan dengan yang lainnya. Jadi itu menimbulkan kematian dan dia akan ada di pojok kanan atas ini. Yang lainnya saya kira ini kalau dikaitannya dengan keseringan dia ditolak dengan rejection rates ya, berkali-kali ditolak gitu ya. Kemudian dikaitkan dengan jumlah yang dimasukkan ke rumah sakit, maka ternyata Salmonella mahi-mahi. Nah itu rupanya mungkin sering ditolak. Mungkin juga banyak diekspor juga mungkin ya. Dan seterusnya. Dan kemudian kalau dikaitkan dengan jumlah yang meninggal. Nah, ingin saya sampaikanlah dari data tersebut, kemudian kita bisa memprioritaskan, ya, bagaimana selanjutnya kita bisa menangani ini. Jadi semua yang masuk kategori-kategori di atas ini, ya, sini potensi dari prioritasi dari dampak kesehatan dan ekonomi, kita bisa melihat ternyata prioritas tertinggi dari dampak kesehatan dan ekonomi ini pada hasil penolakan dari perikanan yang ditolak itu adalah pasangan dari Salmonella tuna dan Salmonella udang. Memang sih sudah terasa sekarang ini memang itu yang menjadi masalah. Tapi dari kajian-kajian ini dibandingkan dengan pasangan-pasangan ikan yang lain, memang itu ada di paling atas. Ya. Jadi ini catatan ini hanya untuk memberikan gambaran bahwa yang pojok kanan ini adalah yang paling berisiko dikaitkan dengan kesehatan, dampak kesehatan dan dampak ekonomi. Jadi ini sudah masuk unsur-unsur economic risk di sini, tidak hanya sekedar dampak kesehatan. Nah, dari situlah kemudian berikutnya kami sudah Pak Nugroho ini sudah membuat paper dan sudah dimasukkan ke international journal, sudah direview dan sudah diperbaikan reviewnya. Itu follow up dari temuan ini. Jadi waktu itu survei dilakukan terhadap para pelaku usaha, ya, terutama yang eksportir, dikaji betul bagaimana faktor risiko dari proses mulai ikan ditangkap sampai kemudian diekspor. Nah itu diteliti semuanya. Sudah tentu ini berbasis virtual sekarang dengan kuesioner, tapi secara detail dievaluasi. Dengan demikian bisa ditemukan nanti kapan kontaminan itu dari mikroba tersebut kapan naik, kapan turun. Kalau turun kan pasti ada proses pemanasan. Tapi kan di sini tidak ada. Jadi kapan naiknya itu dimonitor. Nah, itu dimonitor dan sudah dilakukan kajian dan ditemukan di mana tahap-tahap yang menimbulkan risiko tersebut. Nah, sekarang sedang dilakukan penelitian di laboratorium, melakukan pengujian terhadap salmonella dalam udang, menggunakan PCR sudah tentu, kemudian untuk menentukan food safety objektif daripada proses tersebut. Nah, itu karena penting sekali bahwa food safety objektif adalah suatu kriteria berapa besar hazard pada saat kita konsumsi, dan itu adalah berkontribusi kepada appropriate level of protection. Data itu sangat penting. Jadi kita mengkaji antara risiko kesehatan dan risiko ekonomi untuk bisa menentukan FSO. Itu kira-kira tambahan dari saya terkait dengan kasus ini karena diminta oleh tim. Baik, itu saja. Terima kasih. Terima kasih kepada PKIPM atas data-data yang diberikan kepada kami. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih Prof. Dedi untuk paparannya mengenai kasus dan data-data dari PKIPM tadi ya. Selanjutnya dari Bapak Ibu, apakah ada pertanyaan ataukah ada yang ingin didiskusikan terkait materi dari Prof. Dedi? Baik, sepertinya sudah ada
Mita,
ya.
Mbak Mita mungkin
yes.
bisa dipanggil untuk Ibu Purwaningsih.
Oh ya.
Mr. Alain sudah menjawab pertanyaan dari
di
Ibu
ya.
Purwaningsih.
Ya, baik. Apakah Ibu Purwaningsih masih ada, masih join? Tadi pertanyaan Ibu mengenai risk characterization, apakah dipakai juga, apakah masuk untuk orang dewasa seperti itu ya? Ini tadi Mr. Alain sudah jawab di chat room.
Ibu Purwaningsih, saya lihat masih ada di dalam.
Masih ada ya?
Iya, masih ada Mbak Mita.
Oke, iya. Mungkin lagi double juga kali Mbak.
Kenapa?
Oke, Ibu Purwaningsih.
Bukan kayak. Ya, mungkin lagi double juga mungkin Mbak Siti.
Iya, Bu, maaf.
Oh iya, Ibu. Tadi Ibu ada pertanyaan ya?
Ya,
untuk
saya
Mr. Alain.
Ya, dijawab lagi langsung. Oke.
Ya, sudah dijawab tadi?
Ya,
apakah ada yang ingin ditambahkan atau dikomentari, Bu, dari
Mr.
jawaban?
Alain sudah langsung pribadi ini saya caca ya, jadi sudah jelas. Terima kasih, Bu.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih, Bu Purwaningsih.
Sama-sama, Bu.
Baik, apabila sudah tidak ada diskusi lagi, mungkin dari Karsten bisa menyampaikan untuk closing. Kebetulan Pak Wahyu sedang berhalangan, sedang ada tamu.
Thank you very much, Mita. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Dedi and Mr. Alain for the presentation and the well-delivered 3 workshops. It has not been possible for me to follow all the workshops. I've been busy preparing myself to go to Jakarta, where I just arrived yesterday. But I have looked at the PowerPoint presentations, and I've learned a lot even from the PowerPoint presentations without any words from the 2 gentlemen. Secondly, I would like to thank all the participants for attending these workshops, which hopefully have provided you with new knowledge or perhaps served as brush-ups on areas you are familiar with already. Arise Plus continues for approximately 1 more year, and we plan to have a few more workshops in cooperation with BSN. But for the time being, we do not plan to have more workshops or webinars about food standardization or food regulation. But nothing is written into stones, and it can be changed if there is a demand for a specific topic. And of course, we are listening for this. Food products is an important export commodity for Indonesia, and for each product area, there may be different needs. I know a little about what was required for the fish producers. I don't know so much about processed food, but you can probably find a lot of different areas with different needs. I'm sorry that it will not be possible for RISE Plus to provide workshops in specific and perhaps narrow product areas. We have to cover it a bit broader so that we can have as many people attending the webinars or workshops as possible. But I hope that these 3 workshops have contributed to your general knowledge and your understanding of the framework when you search for information about more specific areas. With these words, I would like to say thank you for the participation and for all your questions on behalf of the 2 gentlemen. I know they appreciate to have this kind of dialogue with the participants. And with these words, I would also like to declare the workshop as closed. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih Karsten untuk closingnya. Terima kasih kami ucapkan kepada Bapak Ibu peserta workshop yang selama 3 hari ini mengikuti baik melalui Zoom maupun melalui YouTube. Terima kasih kepada Prof. Dedi, Mr. Allen, dan tim RISE Plus Indonesia. Mohon maaf untuk kekurangan dalam acara ini. Semoga kita bisa bertemu di lain waktu. Terima kasih, selamat sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you very much, Karsten.
Terima kasih.
Alain,
Terima kasih.
pribadi. Terima kasih semuanya.
Bye.
Terima kasih Mbak Mita. Thank you Karsten. Thank you
Ya, terima
Alain.
kasih. Thank you, Karsten. Izin live.